Close your eyes and let the heavy curtains of the present world fall away, leaving you suspended in a space where time moves slower, softer, and with the rhythm of a deep, resting breath. Imagine the light first, not the harsh glare of a modern screen, but the golden, honeyed warmth of the Mediterranean sun as it begins to dip towards the Aegean Sea, casting long violet shadows across white marble and dusty earth. You are drifting back, floating gently on the currents of history, until you touch down in a world of sandals and stone, of chattering cicadas and heated debates. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. In the warm dust of ancient Athens, where olive trees whispered in the evening wind and stone streets echoed with debate, there lived a man who owned nothing, wrote nothing, and yet changed the direction of human thought forever. His name was Socrates. He walked barefoot through the city, speaking softly, asking simple questions, and gently unsettling everyone who believed they already knew the truth. This is not the story of a tyrant or a conqueror. It is the story of how a democracy, proud of its freedom, chose to silence its wisest voice. Athens, in the late 5th century BCE, was exhausted. Years of war had drained its wealth, humbled its navy, and shattered its confidence. The long struggle against Sparta had ended in defeat, and with defeat came fear. Fear of chaos, fear of change, fear of voices that did not conform. Democracy had returned after a brief and brutal oligarchic rule, but it returned wounded, suspicious, and eager to protect itself. In such a city, a man like Socrates was dangerous, not because he carried weapons, but because he carried questions. Socrates did not teach in schools or accept payment. He spoke in marketplaces, gymnasiums, and doorways. He questioned generals about courage, politicians about justice, poets about wisdom, and priests about piety. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Those who claimed knowledge could not define the very ideas they defended. Socrates did not humiliate them with insults. He simply followed their words to their logical end, where contradictions waited patiently. And when the illusion of certainty collapsed, it was painful. Not everyone forgives the man who shows them they are wrong. Over time, resentment grew. Powerful men watched their sons follow Socrates instead of tradition. Orators found themselves mocked in public. Citizens began to whisper that this strange philosopher corrupted the youth and undermined respect for the gods. In a city that believed harmony depended on shared beliefs, Socrates seemed like a crack in the foundation. The formal charges were simple and devastating. Socrates was accused of impiety, of not believing in the gods of the city, and of corrupting the young. These were not abstract crimes. They struck at the heart of Athenian identity. To deny the gods was to deny the city itself. To corrupt the youth was to threaten the future. The accusers did not need proof beyond suspicion and fear. The law allowed citizens to prosecute citizens, and once the case began, there was no turning back. The trial took place before a large jury, hundreds of ordinary Athenians chosen by lot. There were no lawyers in the modern sense. Socrates spoke for himself. He did not beg, he did not flatter, he did not soften his words. Instead, he did what he had always done. He questioned, he challenged, he spoke calmly, even kindly, but without apology. He told the jury that he was not a teacher, only a seeker of truth. He claimed that his questioning was a service to the city, like a gadfly keeping a great horse awake. This was not the defense the jury expected. In Athenian courts, emotion mattered, tears mattered. Family members were brought forward to stir sympathy. Socrates refused all of it. He said that fear of death should never outweigh fear of injustice. He suggested, half serious, half ironic, that instead of punishment, he deserved free meals for life as a benefactor of Athens. To many jurors, this was arrogance. To others, madness. To a few, unbearable honesty. The verdict was close, but not close enough. Socrates was found guilty. According to Athenian law, the convicted man could propose an alternative penalty. Exile was common. A fine would have been acceptable. Socrates refused exile, saying he would never stop questioning, no matter where he went. Eventually, at the urging of friends, he agreed to a modest fine. The jury rejected it. Death was chosen instead. Execution did not come immediately. A sacred mission delayed the sentence, and during this time, Socrates' friends planned his escape. The prison was poorly guarded. The route was clear. All he had to do was leave. Socrates refused. He argued that breaking the law, even an unjust law, would destroy the moral order he had spent his life defending. If he fled, he would teach that convenience mattered more than justice. He chose consistency over survival. On the final day, Socrates drank hemlock as the sun set. Witnesses said his final moments were calm. He spoke about the soul, about the possibility that death was not an end, but a deep, dreamless sleep, or perhaps a journey to converse with other great minds. As the poison reached his heart, the man who had spent his life questioning fell silent. Athens would soon regret its choice. Within a generation, Socrates became a symbol of wisdom, betrayed by power, of truth crushed by fear. His student Plato preserved his voice in dialogues that still shape philosophy today. Through them, Socrates continues to ask his quiet questions, long after the city that condemned him turned to dust. This is why the trial of Socrates matters. It was not just a legal proceeding. It was a moment when democracy revealed its shadow, a reminder that the will of the majority is not always the voice of wisdom, that freedom of speech is fragile when fear speaks louder than reason, and that sometimes the most dangerous man in the city is the one who asks very gently, "Are you sure?" As you rest now, let the streets of ancient Athens fade into darkness. The voices of the jury grow quiet. The philosopher's footsteps echo once more, then disappear. But his questions remain, drifting through time, patient and unafraid, waiting for the next mind brave enough to listen. But let us not stay at the end, where the shadows are longest. Let us drift back to the beginning, before the hemlock was ground into poison, before the accusations were inked onto papyrus. Let us walk into the agora on a bright, ordinary morning, when Socrates was simply a man, not a martyr. The air here smells of drying figs, unwashed wool, and the distinct sharp tang of roasting garlic from a nearby food stall. It is a chaotic, vibrant, sensory tapestry. To your left, merchants are shouting the prices of pottery. To your right, slaves carry water jars from the fountains, their feet slapping rhythmically against the dirt. And there, standing near the tables of the money changers, is a figure who seems entirely out of place among the finely dressed aristocrats and busy traders. He is not handsome. In fact, by the standards of Greek beauty, which prized symmetry and athletic grace, Socrates is aggressively odd. He has a snub nose that turns upward, wide, bulging eyes that seem to take in everything at once, like a crab, some joked, and a thick neck that speaks of peasant strength rather than refined breeding. He wears a single garment, the tribon, a rough woolen cloak that has seen better years, perhaps better decades. He wears it in summer's heat and winter's frost, indifferent to the temperature, just as he is indifferent to the stares of passers-by. He is barefoot, his heels calloused from thousands of miles of walking these same circular paths. Historians still argue whether Socrates ever truly worked a trade. Some ancient sources suggest he was trained as a stonecutter, like his father, and perhaps even sculpted a set of the three graces that stood on the Acropolis. Though most agree that if he ever held a chisel, he dropped it long ago to carve souls instead of marble. He does not look like a threat to the state. He looks like a vagrant, or perhaps a slightly confused grandfather who has wandered away from home. But watch. A wealthy young politician, draped in purple-bordered robes, tries to sweep past him. Socrates steps gently into his path. He does not shout. He smiles, a genuine, warm expression that crinkles the corners of those wide eyes. "Good morning, friend," he might say, his voice rumbly and calm, cutting through the noise of the market. "You look like a man who knows exactly where he is going. Tell me, since you are in such a hurry to do important things, what exactly is the important?" The politician stops. He blinks. It is such a simple question. Surely he knows the answer. But as he opens his mouth to speak, he finds the words sticking in his throat. And Socrates waits, head tilted, listening with an intensity that makes the rest of the market fade away. This is the man the city will one day fear, the man who stops the rush of the world to ask, why? To understand the man, we must understand the stage upon which he walked. For Athens was not merely a backdrop of stone and sky, but a living, breathing participant in the drama, a city of startling contradictions, where the divine and the desperate rubbed shoulders in the dust. Lift your gaze now from the bustling marketplace, up the steep, craggy slopes of the Acropolis, the high city that crowned Athens like a diadem of rock. In the glowing amber light of the afternoon, the Parthenon stands not as the bleached, bone-white ruin we see today in museums, but as it was then, a riot of vivid, breathing color. Modern archaeology has revealed a truth that Victorian historians often scrubbed away. The ancient Greeks loved color with a passion that bordered on the psychedelic. The friezes of the gods were not ghostly pale, but painted in deep azures, rich terracottas, and vibrant ochres, with weapons of bronze and gold glinting in the sun, making the temple look less like a tomb and more like a jewel box exploded by the gods. It was a visual shout of power and piety, visible for miles out at sea, a beacon telling every sailor that this city was favored by Athena herself. But if you lower your eyes from that soaring height, down past the olive groves, and into the tangled maze of the residential districts, the grandeur abruptly vanishes, replaced by the humble, messy reality of human life. The streets of Athens were not wide boulevards designed for parades. They were narrow, winding arteries of beaten earth, barely wide enough for two loaded donkeys to pass without a stubborn argument and a traffic jam of braying. There were no grand facades here. The houses were low, built of sun-dried mud, brick on stone foundations, turning their backs to the street. A blank wall faced the public, broken only by a sturdy wooden door For the Athenian home was a fortress of privacy in a city of relentless publicity. The true life of the house happened inside, in the open-air courtyard where women wove wool, children played with knucklebone dice, and the family altar smoked with small offerings to household gods. It is a strange paradox that in a city obsessed with public speech and visibility, the domestic world was a secret garden, walled off and silent. Walking these streets required a certain agility and a good sense of smell. There was no underground sewage system here, only the slope of the land and the occasional open channel. The air would be thick with a complex perfume of civilization, the sharp, resinous scent of pine wood burning in ovens, the heavy, sweet odor of jasmine spilling over a garden wall, the metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge, and, undeniably, the ripe, earthy smell of a city with thousands of bodies and very few drains. It was said that you could navigate Athens with your nose as well as your eyes, knowing you were near the tanner's district by the acrid sting of urine used to cure leather, or near the baker's quarter by the warm, yeast-heavy breeze that made your stomach rumble. Into this sensory, chaotic mix walked Socrates, a man who seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere at all. While other men hurried from the privacy of their homes to the exclusivity of their dinner parties, Socrates lived entirely in the space between. He was a creature of the open air. He claimed that the trees and the countryside had nothing to teach him, whereas the men in the city did. And so he remained within the walls, a permanent fixture of the urban landscape, like a talking statue. Historians and urban planners still debate the exact population density of Athens during this period, but whether the number was closer to 200,000 or 300,000, the psychological reality was one of intense, inescapable intimacy. Everyone knew everyone, or at least, everyone knew someone who knew you. In such a tight-knit web, privacy was suspicious, and solitude was seen as a mild form of madness. To be alone was to be a non-entity, to be a citizen was to be seen. This closeness created a unique acoustic atmosphere. Athens was a loud city. It did not hum, it roared. From the Pnyx, the rocky hill where the assembly met, came the sound of thousands of men shouting, voting, and cheering, a sound like the crashing of waves against a cliff. From the gymnasiums came the thud of wrestling bodies and the splash of oil. And everywhere there was a talk. The Greeks loved the spoken word more than perhaps any people in history. They didn't just communicate, they performed. A fishmonger selling eels didn't just state a price. He gave a speech about the distinct, heroic qualities of the eel, its journey from the marsh, and the tragedy of selling it so cheap. A simple dispute over a property line could turn into a sidewalk oration that would make a modern senator blush. Into this cacophony, Socrates brought a different kind of sound, the sound of a pause. He did not shout over the fishmonger or the politician. He waited, and when he spoke, he often used metaphors that were startlingly mundane, grounding his lofty philosophy in the dirt of the street. He didn't talk about celestial spheres. He talked about cobblers, mule drivers, and cooks. He asked if a ship captain should be elected by popularity or chosen for his skill in navigation. He asked if a horse trainer makes horses better, while the rest of the world harms them. His examples were drawn from the mud brick reality around him, making his questions accessible to anyone who would listen, yet dangerous to anyone who thought too deeply. It is easy to romanticize this world, to imagine it as a paradise of white togas and deep thoughts. But we must remember the shadows. The mud bricks of the houses would crumble in the rain and had to be constantly patched. The streets turned to rivers of sludge in winter. And for all its beauty, the city was a place of stark vulnerability. Life was fragile. A scratch from a rusty nail could kill a strong man in a week. A fever could sweep through a household and leave silence in its wake. This proximity to death gave the Athenians a fierce hunger for life, for legacy, for doing something that would outlast the mud brick and the flesh. They built temples of marble because they knew everything else would wash away. And perhaps this is why Socrates fascinated them, even as he annoyed them. He didn't care about the marble or the legacy. He walked through the chaotic, smelly, beautiful, noisy streets of Athens wearing the same cloak in summer and winter, indifferent to the heat and the cold, seemingly immune to the anxieties that drove his neighbors to chase wealth and honor. He was a still point in a turning world. As the evening sun began to set, painting the white stucco walls in shades of violet and rose, the noise of the city would soften, but never truly stop. Lamps were lit, small flickers of olive oil burning in clay bowls, casting dancing shadows against the walls. It was in these transitional hours, when the work was done and the wine was mixed with water, that the real questions could be asked. But for Socrates, the question was never, "How much money did I make today?" or "What will the neighbors think?" It was always something far more troubling. And the origin of his trouble, the spark that set him on his collision course with the city he loved, did not begin in Athens at all. It began miles away on the slopes of a holy mountain in a cloud of intoxicating vapor, with a riddle that sounded like a joke. Leave the sticky heat of the Athenian basin now, and let your spirit travel north and west, rising higher and higher until the air turns thin, crisp, and cold. We are leaving the world of men for the world of the gods. We are climbing the jagged, imposing slopes of Mount Parnassus to the sanctuary of Delphi, a place the ancient Greeks believed was nothing less than the navel of the world. The landscape here is dramatic, almost violent in its beauty. Massive grey cliffs sheer upward into the sky, dwarfing the human pilgrims who trudge up the sacred way. Eagles circle silently on thermals, their shadows flickering over the treasuries and statues that line the path. Gifts from kings and cities, hoping to buy a little favor from the divine. It is a place of overwhelming silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the gorges and the low chanting of priests. Unlike Athens, which buzzed with the chaotic energy of commerce and debate, Delphi vibrated with a different frequency. The heavy electric tension of prophecy. Here the veil between the mortal and the immortal was worn thin, and if one listened carefully, one might hear the whispers of Apollo himself. Into this awe-inspiring landscape walked a man named Chaerephon. He was a close friend of Socrates, but in temperament, they were opposites. Where Socrates was slow, deliberate, and steady as a plough ox, Chaerephon was frantic, intense, and possessed of a manic energy that exhausted everyone around him. The comic playwrights of Athens mocked him as the Bat for his pale complexion and his nocturnal habits, and he was known as the kind of man who didn't just walk to the market. He launched himself at it. It was this impulsive, wild-haired intensity that drove him to make the arduous journey to Delphi, not to ask about the outcome of a war or the success of a harvest, but to settle a debate. He wanted to ask a question about his friend. It was a bold, perhaps even arrogant question to bring before the terrifying majesty of the oracle. But Cherifon was not a man to be deterred by social nuances. He marched up the sacred way, past the shimmering bronze statues and the marble treasury houses, right to the entrance of the great temple of Apollo. Inside the temple, the air was different. It was cool, dim, and heavy with incense. In the inner sanctum, the Adyton sat the Pythia, the high priestess. She was not a young, nubile virgin, as later Victorian painters liked to imagine, but typically an older woman, a local peasant chosen for her virtuous life, dressed in the formal robes of a maiden. She sat upon a golden tripod, perched above a fissure in the earth. For centuries, historians dismissed the ancient descriptions of sweet-smelling vapors rising from this crack as mere hallucination or priestly theater. However, modern geology has offered a fascinating vindication of the myth. We now know that two major fault lines intersect directly beneath the temple, and it is chemically possible that ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon with mild hallucinogenic properties, seeped up through the porous limestone rock. So, when the ancients said the priestess was intoxicated by the breath of the god, they may have been scientifically accurate, even if their theology was poetic. In this trance state, she became the mouthpiece of Apollo, her voice changing, her words often tumbling out in garbled poetic riddles that the male priests, the prophetai, would interpret and write down for the seeker. Cherifon stood before this terrifying figure, the smoke swirling around her ankles, and asked his simple, blunt question: "Is there any man living who is wiser than Socrates?" The priests likely paused. They were used to questions about colonization, plague, and dynastic marriage. A question about an eccentric, barefoot philosopher from Athens was trivial by comparison, and yet, the Pythia answered. The response was uncharacteristically direct. There was no riddle, no ambiguous poem that could be read two ways. The answer was a flat, devastating negative. No one is wiser. Cherifon, presumably vibrating with triumph, rushed back to Athens to deliver the news. One can imagine him finding Socrates in a gymnasium, perhaps scraping the dust off his legs after a workout, or sitting on a bench watching the youth train. Cherifon would have been breathless, his eyes wide, announcing the verdict of the god like a thunderclap. "Socrates, Apollo has spoken. He says you are the wisest man alive." Most men would have been flattered. A politician would have used it as a campaign slogan. A poet would have written an ode to himself. Socrates, however, was horrified. He did not smile. He did not puff out his chest. He fell into a profound confusion. This moment is the pivot point of his entire life, the heartbeat where a local eccentric became a historical force. Socrates truly believed he knew nothing. This wasn't a pose. It was a deep, unsettling conviction. He looked at the world and saw infinite complexity. He looked at his own mind and saw only ignorance. He knew nothing of the physical sciences, nothing of the nature of the stars, nothing of the true will of the gods. So, he was faced with a divine paradox. On one hand, the oracle was the voice of Apollo, and the god cannot lie. To say the god lied would be blasphemy. On the other hand, Socrates knew, with absolute certainty, that he was not wise. Therefore, the statement, "Socrates is the wisest," and the fact Socrates is ignorant, had to be reconciled. But they seemed mutually exclusive. It was a logic puzzle designed by a deity. Instead of accepting the compliment, Socrates decided to treat the oracle's statement as a riddle that needed to be solved. He decided to investigate the meaning of the god's words, not to disprove the god, that would be impious, but to understand the hidden truth behind the apparent falsehood. He reasoned, if I can find a man who is wiser than I am, I can go to the god and say, look, here is a man wiser than me, yet you said I was the wisest. What did you mean? It was a humble mission on the surface, but it carried a sting. To validate the god, he had to invalidate the wisdom of men. He had to go out and test the reputations of the city's most respected figures. He viewed it as a religious service, a sacred duty to cross-examine the world. He was not trying to be annoying, at least not entirely. He was trying to solve a divine mystery. And so, the great testing began. He didn't start with the common people. He started at the top. He went to the politicians, the men who claimed to know how to run the state, the men who gave thunderous speeches about justice and virtue. One can imagine the scene. A prominent statesman, surrounded by sycophants, holding court in the agora. Socrates approaches, head bowed respectfully, looking like a harmless admirer. Sir, he might have said, the god has puzzled me, and I look to you for help. You are known far and wide for your wisdom in matters of justice. Everyone says so. Surely you can tell me, what is justice? Is it simply paying one's debts? Or is there more? The politician flattered would give a standard answer. Justice is doing good to friends and harm to enemies. Socrates would nod, then pause. But what if our friends are actually bad people, and our enemies are good? Is it just to harm a good man? The politician would frown, adjust his definition. Socrates would ask another question, and another. Slowly, painfully, the politician's confidence would unravel. The crowd would stop cheering and start listening. The definition would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The politician would grow red in the face, flustered, perhaps angry, realizing that he had never actually defined the term he used every day. He was parroting words, not possessing wisdom. Socrates walked away from that first encounter with a dawning realization, a sudden flash of light in the fog. I am better off than he is, he thought, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know. This was the secret. This was the answer to the riddle. The wisdom Socrates possessed was a negative wisdom, a human wisdom, as he called it. It was the awareness of his own limitations. In a world of arrogant certainty, the man who knows he is lost is the only one who can truly see the map. The oracle was right, but in a way that was a stinging indictment of everyone else. The wisest man was simply the one who admitted his own ignorance. It was a profound insight, but it had a terrible side effect. By proving the god right, Socrates was proving the powerful men of Athens wrong. And as he moved from the politicians to the poets, and from the poets to the craftsmen, leaving a trail of deflated egos in his wake, the laughter of the crowd began to sour into something else. The bat, Chaerephon, had brought back a gift from Delphi, but it was a gift wrapped in dynamite, and Socrates had just lit the fuse. The sun climbs higher over the agora, baking the clay tiles of the stoa and casting the bustling market into sharp relief. But for the prominent men of Athens, the heat is no longer coming from the sky. It is coming from a soft-spoken man with an annoying habit of asking why. Socrates took his mission from the oracle seriously. treating it not as a puzzle to be solved in the quiet of a study, but as a public audit of the Athenian soul. He moved through the city like a surveyor searching for rot in the foundations, and he began to test the pillars upon which the city's reputation rested. Imagine the scene, not as a dry historical footnote, but as a dense, quiet drama unfolding in the corner of a crowded square. A circle of onlookers gathers, idle shopkeepers, curious slaves, and inevitably, a gaggle of wealthy young men who have nothing better to do than watch their elders squirm. In the center stands a politician, a man of gravitas, perhaps draped in a cloak of fine Milesian wool, gesturing expansively as he speaks of virtue and the good of the state. And opposite him stands Socrates, looking like a gargoyle who wandered off a roof, head cocked, listening with a terrifying, patient silence. When the politician finishes, expecting applause, he gets a question instead. "That was beautifully spoken, O Callias," Socrates might say, "but you used the word virtue 3 times. I am a simple man and slow of mind. Could you explain to me what virtue actually is? Is it one thing or many? Is it like a swarm of bees where all are different, yet all are bees?" The politician smiles indulgently. He gives a standard answer, a list of virtuous acts. Socrates gently shakes his head. "I did not ask for a swarm of bees, my friend. I asked for the definition of a bee." And so the unraveling begins. Thread by thread, the politician's confidence is pulled apart. He defines virtue as the capacity to govern. Socrates points out that this excludes women and children, who can also be virtuous. He redefines it as the power to enjoy good things. Socrates asks if this includes the power to enjoy bad things unjustly. Within minutes, the politician is trapped in a web of his own making, forced to admit that he does not actually know the definition of the concept he claims to master. The crowd titters. The young men nudge each other. The politician flushes with a mix of shame and rage, for in Athens, to lose an argument is not just an intellectual defeat. It is a loss of time, of honor. He walks away not enlightened, but humiliated, and a humiliated man is a dangerous enemy. But Socrates did not stop with the politicians. He reasoned that perhaps wisdom was not in the realm of statecraft, but in the realm of the spirit. So he turned his steps toward the poets. In ancient Greece, poets were not merely entertainers. They were the theologians, the historians, and the moral teachers of the society. Homer was the Bible and the encyclopedia wrapped into one. To question a poet was to question the very source of cultural authority. Socrates approached the tragic playwrights and the writers of dithyrambs, holding copies of their own works in his hands. He would point to a particularly moving passage, a stanza that made audiences weep and hearts swell, and ask the author, "What did you mean here? What truth were you trying to convey?" The result was shocking. The poets stammered. They offered vague, flowery explanations that made little sense. They contradicted themselves. It became painfully clear to Socrates that these men did not write from a place of wisdom or understanding. They wrote from instinct, or perhaps, as the Greeks believed, from divine madness, enthusiasm, literally meaning having the God inside. For they were like prophets or seers who delivered messages they did not understand, mere vessels for a muse they could not control. To Socrates, this was not wisdom. It was a kind of accidental brilliance. A poet explaining his own poem turned out to be like a parent trying to explain a teenager. confused, proud, and ultimately just guessing. Socrates left them, concluding that while their words were beautiful, their minds were as empty of true knowledge as the politicians. The poets naturally did not appreciate being told that their genius was merely a happy accident of biology or divinity. They too added their names to the growing list of men who wished Socrates would simply go away. Finally, seeking someone, anyone who knew something true, Socrates went to the craftsmen, the artisans. He visited the potters at their wheels, the cobblers at their benches, the smiths hammering bronze into shields. Here, at last, he found a glimmer of light. When he asked a shoemaker how to make a shoe, the man could tell him. He knew the leather, the tools, the technique. He possessed a genuine knowledge, a technique that Socrates lacked. The shoemaker knew something true about the world. For a moment, Socrates was hopeful. But then, the shadow fell. Because the shoemaker knew how to make excellent shoes, he assumed he also knew how to make excellent laws, how to lead an army, and how to judge the affairs of the gods. The halo of their specific competence blinded them to their general ignorance. They mistook skill for wisdom. Socrates concluded that he was still better off than they were. He was ignorant, but at least he knew it. They were ignorant, but their technical skill fooled them into thinking they were wise. This was the tragedy of the expert. The belief that knowing one thing means knowing everything. And so, the artisans joined the politicians and the poets in their resentment. It is important to understand the cumulative effect of these encounters. Socrates wasn't just having private conversations. He was performing a public service that looked suspiciously like public mockery. And he was not alone. He was often trailed by a retinue of young, wealthy aristocrats, the golden youth of Athens. These were the sons of the very men Socrates was dismantling. They watched with glee as the barefoot philosopher tied their fathers and uncles into logical knots. They treated the elenchus, the Socratic method of cross-examination, as a spectator sport, a bloodless gladiator match of the mind. Worse, they began to imitate him. They would go home and cross-examine their elders, mimicking Socrates' style, but lacking his moral seriousness, using logic as a weapon to humiliate rather than a tool to uncover truth. To the older generation, this was intolerable. It looked as though Socrates was the ringleader of a gang of intellectual vandals, teaching the youth to disrespect authority and tear down tradition. Historians still argue whether Socrates actively encouraged this behavior, or if he was simply a charismatic magnet who couldn't shake off his followers. But to the men of Athens, the distinction didn't matter. They saw the result. A city where the old hierarchies were being laughed at by a man who claimed to know nothing. The atmosphere in the city began to curdle. The wind was changing. Socrates was no longer just an eccentric character, a character of the city like a town crier or a stray dog everyone fed. He was becoming a problem. He was the grain of sand in the eye of the establishment. And while he smiled and claimed he was only serving the god Apollo, the men he embarrassed saw only arrogance. He was stripping away their defenses, exposing the hollow spaces where their wisdom was supposed to be. It is a painful thing to be stripped naked in the middle of the marketplace, especially when you're wearing the robes of authority. They began to whisper. They began to watch him with cold eyes. They began to wait for him to make a mistake. And Athens, in those years, was a city where mistakes could be fatal. The mood of the city was darkening, not just because of one philosopher, but because the golden age was bleeding out. The long sunlit afternoon of Periclean Athens was ending, and the storm clouds of war were gathering on the horizon. A war that would last for a generation. A war that would harden hearts, kill thousands, and turn the city of wisdom into a city of fear. Socrates continued his questioning, moving through the streets with his slow rolling gait, seemingly unaware that the ground beneath his feet was becoming brittle. He was testing the soul of Athens, but he was about to discover that a soul, when pressed too hard, does not always confess. Sometimes it snaps. The golden light of the afternoon is fading now, not just because the sun is dipping below the mountains, but because a deeper, longer shadow is stretching across the Greek world. To understand why Athens eventually turned on its own conscience, we must understand the 27 years of nightmare that preceded the trial. We call it the Peloponnesian War, a dry name for a conflict that tore the heart out of the ancient Mediterranean. It was not a war of weeks or months. It was a war of a lifetime. A child born when the first trumpets sounded would be a graying veteran by the time the surrender was signed. It was a struggle between the whale and the elephant. Athens, the master of the sea, the champion of radical democracy and chaotic freedom, against Sparta, the lord of the land, the silent, disciplined machine of oligarchy. The war did not just break bodies, it broke the unwritten rules of a civilization. It turned neighbors into spies and twisted the very meaning of words, until recklessness was praised as courage and moderation was sneered at as cowardice. Imagine the view from the high walls of Athens in the early years of the war. Pericles, the great statesman, has convinced the people of a radical, terrifying strategy. He knows the Athenian army cannot beat the Spartans in an open field. No one can. So he orders the impossible. He tells the farmers of Attica, the men who live for their vineyards and their ancestral olive groves, to abandon their homes. Come inside the walls, he says. Bring your wives, your children, your bedding, even the woodwork of your houses. And they come. They flood into the city, filling the empty spaces, building shanties in temple precincts, sleeping in the towers of the fortifications. The city swells, groaning under the pressure. And then, the psychological torture begins. Stand on the ramparts and look north. See the columns of black smoke rising into the clear blue sky. That is the Spartan army, methodically burning the farms, hacking down the olive trees that take a generation to grow. The Athenians have to watch their livelihoods turn to ash, forbidden to go out and fight. The air in the city grows hot, thick with the smell of too many bodies and the acrid taste of impotence. The mood shifts from patriotic fervor to a simmering claustrophobic rage. Democracy is messy enough in times of peace. In a besieged city, it becomes a pressure cooker waiting to explode. And where is Socrates in this chaos? We often picture him as an old man, a thinker, a lover of words. But we must shatter that image to see the truth. Socrates was a hoplite. In the ancient world, citizenship was blood deep. To vote was to fight. And despite his claims of poverty, historians verify that he possessed the means to buy his own bronze armor, placing him in the middle class of the infantry. He strapped on the heavy greaves, the breastplate, and lifted the aspis, the great round shield, and marched to the edges of the known world to kill for his city. He was not just a soldier, He was a legend among the ranks. Let us drift north to the bitter cold of Potidaea, a campaign fought in the freezing damp of the northern Aegean. The Athenian troops are miserable. They wrap their feet in felt and sheepskins, shivering as the frost bites into their bones. But look at Socrates. He is walking barefoot on the ice. He is wearing his same thin cloak. He marches with a steady, rhythmic indifference that baffles his comrades. They don't know whether to admire him or hate him. Is he mocking their weakness, or is he simply made of stone? One morning, he stops. He falls into thought. He stands there, motionless, staring at nothing. Noon comes and goes. The soldiers joke about him as they eat their rations. Evening falls. Some Ionians bring out their sleeping mats, curious to see how long he will last. Socrates stands through the night, under the wheeling stars, a statue of flesh. Only when the sun rises, the next morning, does he blink, say a prayer to the sun, and walk away as if nothing happened. It is a terrifying display of mental discipline. He is showing them that the body is a servant, not a master. But it is in the chaos of retreat that his true character shines. Flash forward to the disaster at Delium. The Athenian line has collapsed. Panic is a contagion. Men are throwing away their shields, the ultimate disgrace, and running for their lives. The Spartan cavalry is cutting them down like wheat. Amidst this stampede of terror, one figure is walking, not running, walking. It is Socrates. He is carrying his shield, and he is not alone. He is guiding the young, terrified General Laches to safety. Alcibiades, the golden youth, is there on horseback, and he later describes the scene with awe. He says Socrates was stalking like a pelican, his head turning from side to side, his great bulging eyes scanning the battlefield, telegraphing a clear message to the enemy. If you touch me, you will regret it. The Spartan pursuers, seeing this strange, calm beast of a man, swerve away to chase easier prey. In the midst of a rout, where courage usually dissolves into instinct, Socrates remains governed by reason. He saves his life and the lives of those around him, not by being faster, but by being more possessed of himself. This military service matters. It protected him for a time. The men of the jury years later would remember that this lazy philosopher had stood next to them in the shield wall. They knew he was physically brave, but the war was doing something else to Athens. It was eroding the city's moral center. As the years dragged on, the struggle for survival became an excuse for atrocity. Athens, the beacon of justice, voted to slaughter the entire male population of the rebellious island of Melos, simply because they could. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. The Athenian envoys famously said, this was the new logic of the war. It was a logic that Socrates despised. He saw his beloved city losing its soul to save its skin. He saw the definitions of justice shifting like sand. And so, his questions in the marketplace took on a sharper edge. When he asked, "What is justice?" in 430 BCE, it was a philosophical puzzle. When he asked it in 416 BCE, after the massacre at Melos, it was an accusation. The war also hardened the divide between the generations. The older men, who remembered the glory of Pericles, looked at the youth with suspicion. The young men, raised in the shadow of the long walls, cynical and hardened by violence, looked at their elders with contempt. They saw the war as a failure of the old ways. They were hungry for new ideas, for anything that cut through the hypocrisy of the state. Socrates became their lightning rod. He didn't mean to be a leader of a counterculture, but to the anxious fathers of Athens, he looked like the Pied Piper of a lost generation. He was questioning the authority of the very democracy that was fighting for its life. As the war ground toward its inevitable tragic conclusion, the atmosphere in Athens became brittle. The humor became darker. The comedies of Aristophanes, once full of joyful absurdity, began to scream with desperation. The city was exhausted, bled white of its money and its manpower. Every family had a vacant chair at the dinner table. Every street corner had a beggar who had once been a prosperous farmer. And in this landscape of grief and grit, the tolerance for a man who did nothing but ask difficult questions was wearing thin. The Athenians were like men walking a tightrope over an abyss. They did not want someone shaking the wire to test its tension. They wanted stability. They wanted silence. But Socrates, stubborn as a mule and constant as the North Star, would not be silent. He had faced the Spartan spears at Delium without flinching. He was not about to flinch before the angry stares of his neighbors. But before the final collapse, before the walls came down, a different kind of enemy would breach the gates. An enemy that carried no shield, respected no treaty, and moved faster than any army. The sun that summer rose not like a benevolent god, but like a hammer of bronze, beating down on a city that had nowhere to hide. It was 430 BCE, the second year of the war, and Pericles' strategy of bringing the entire population of Attica inside the long walls had succeeded in protecting the people from Spartan spears. But it had exposed them to something far deadlier. The city was packed tight, a human hive humming with anxiety. Refugees were living in stifling huts made of wattle and clay, crowded into the sacred precincts of temples, sleeping in the recesses of the city gates. The air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, roasting garlic, and the dust of animal fodder. And then, slipping past the blockade runners and the triremes, an invisible passenger arrived at the port of Piraeus. It came, historians believe, from Ethiopia, traveling down the Nile, crossing the Mediterranean, and finally stepping onto the docks of Athens. It was not a soldier. It was a microbe, and within days, the great strategy of the long walls turned the city into a sealed tomb. The plague of Athens had begun. To understand the trauma that would eventually lead a jury to kill Socrates, we must stand in the midst of this catastrophe. It was a horror that defied description, though the historian Thucydides, who caught the disease and somehow survived, recorded it with the clinical, chilling detachment of a modern epidemiologist. It began with a sudden, violent heat in the head, redness and inflammation in the eyes, and a throat that felt like it was on fire. Then came the sneezing, the hoarseness, and a chest-racking cough. But the worst symptom was the burning. The victims felt such an intense internal heat that they could not bear the touch of the lightest linen clothing. They wanted to be naked. They wanted water. The thirst was unquenchable. Men would stagger through the streets, delirious, and throw themselves into the public cisterns and fountains, dying with their faces submerged in the cool water they craved. The medical knowledge of the time was helpless. The doctors were the first to die, which, as Thucydides wryly noted, was a poor advertisement for their cures. Supplications to the gods were useless. The oracles fell silent. The temples, usually places of pristine purity, were filled with the dying, a shocking violation of a religious law that signaled the beginning of a deeper spiritual collapse. Historians and pathologists still argue fiercely over what exactly the plague of Athens was. For centuries, it was the great medical cold case. Was it smallpox, bubonic plague, measles? In recent years, DNA extracted from teeth found in a mass grave from this period suggests it may have been an ancient extinct strain of typhoid fever, a disease born of filth and overcrowding. But to the Athenians, it did not matter what the name was. To them, it looked like the arrows of Apollo, the god of plague, raining down on a city that had lost its way. The death toll was staggering. Perhaps 1/3 of the population perished. 1 in 3. Look around the imaginary marketplace of your mind. For every 3 faces you see, erase 1. The pyres burned day and night. The traditional elaborate funeral rites, so important to the Greek sense of order and piety, were abandoned. There was no wood left for individual fires. Desperate families would carry their dead to a pyre already burning for someone else, throw the body on top, and run away, or they would fight off others to claim a fire. The dignity of death was stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly necessity of disposal. And through this hellscape walked Socrates. By all accounts, he stayed in the city. He did not flee to the countryside like some of the wealthy. He walked the streets, presumably offering what comfort he could, or perhaps simply observing the fragility of the human condition. Remarkably, he did not get sick, or if he did, his iron constitution shrugged it off. He became a symbol of a different kind of immunity, not just physical, but spiritual. While others panicked, he remained calm. While others abandoned their posts, he remained steadfast. But he watched as the moral fabric of Athens dissolved. Thucydides tells us that the plague brought about a state of unprecedented lawlessness. Men saw the rich dying just as quickly as the poor. They saw the pious dying just as painfully as the wicked. The logical conclusion for many was that the gods did not care. Or worse, that they did not exist. Fear of gods or law of man there was none, the historian wrote. Why obey the law if you would be dead by sunset? Why save money if you couldn't take it with you? The survivors were seized by a frantic hedonism, a live-for-today madness that rejected the old virtues of moderation and foresight. They spent their inheritances on wine and pleasure, desperate to feel alive in a city of death. This was the moment the old Athens died. Not the buildings, but the spirit. The generation that survived the plague was hardened, cynical, and deeply scarred. They had seen the abyss, and it made them less tolerant of anyone who questioned the few certainties they had left. The crowning tragedy came with the death of Pericles himself. The great statesman, the man whose voice had guided the democracy for decades, watched his sister die, then his 2 legitimate sons. At the funeral of his last son, the stoic mask finally slipped. Pericles placed a wreath on the boy's head and wept, a broken old man in a broken city. Soon, the sickness took him too. It was not the violent, fiery death of the early victims, but a slow, lingering wasting away, as if the disease wanted to savor the irony of killing the city's brain. With Pericles gone, the helm of the ship of state was left unmanned. The steady hand was replaced by a rotating cast of demagogues, loud, angry men who appealed to the people's basest instincts, their fear and their greed. Men like Cleon the tanner, who shouted where Pericles had persuaded, and who urged violence where Pericles had counseled patience. The democracy became volatile, swinging wildly from one emotion to another, like a patient in the grip of a fever. It is in this shattered, recovering world that the resentment against Socrates began to harden into something more dangerous. He was a reminder of a standard no one could meet anymore. Moreover, the question of impiety was no longer an abstract theological debate. It was a raw nerve. The city had been punished by the gods, or so they feared, and they were terrified of offending them again. They began to look for scapegoats, for pollution, for anything that might be blocking the favor of heaven. And there was Socrates, asking why we should believe the myths, questioning the nature of holiness, refusing to accept the easy answers. In a city recovering from a trauma that had wiped out a third of its people, a man who questioned the gods looked less like a philosopher and more like a risk. The seeds of the trial were sown in the ashes of the plague buyers, but as the sickness faded and the survivors crept out of their houses, blinking in the sunlight, they found that life had to go on. The war was still raging, the Spartans were still at the gates, and a new generation was rising to take the stage, a generation of wolves raised by sheep, led by a young man who was as brilliant as he was broken, a student of Socrates who would become the city's greatest hero and its greatest traitor. If the plague was a horror of the body, the next tragedy to strike Athens was a sickness of the soul, and it wore the most beautiful face in the city. To understand why the jury would later look at Socrates with such hardened suspicion, we must look at the man who sat at his feet, drank from his cup, and then broke the city's heart. His name was Alcibiades. In the gallery of Athenian history, he hangs in the center, painted in colors too bright to be real. He was the ward of Pericles, the descendant of gods, and possessed of a physical beauty so stunning that ancient writers struggle to find words for it, simply noting that he was the most handsome man of his time at every age, as a boy, a youth, and a weathered soldier. He walked with a trailing purple robe, spoke with a fashionable lisp that aristocrats tried to imitate, and moved through the city with the dangerous, careless grace of a panther. He was wealthy, brilliant, charismatic, and utterly ungovernable. And he loved Socrates. The relationship between the barefoot, snub-nosed philosopher and the golden aristocrat is one of the great psychological romances of history, though not in the way we usually use the word. It was a romance of the mind, a desperate tug-of-war for a human soul. Alcibiades was drawn to Socrates as a moth to a strange, cool flame. In a city where everyone wanted something from him, his money, his body, his influence, Socrates wanted nothing. When Alcibiades offered his beauty, expecting to trade it for wisdom in the ancient Greek custom of pederasty, Socrates gently refused. He did not want a lover. He wanted a student. He saw in Alcibiades a terrifying potential. Here was a man who could save Athens or destroy it, depending on which way his spirit turned. Socrates tried to turn him toward virtue, to show him that power without wisdom was just a faster way to crash a chariot. Imagine a scene from Plato's Symposium, set in the flickering lamplight of a rich man's drinking party. The guests are reclining on couches, discussing the nature of love. Suddenly, there is a commotion at the door. A flute girl's melody is drowned out by shouting. Alcibiades stumbles in, drunk, supported by slaves, wearing a massive wreath of ivy and violets. He sees Socrates and sits beside him, draping the wreath over the philosopher's bald head. Then, with the tearful honesty of the intoxicated, he confesses. He tells the room that Socrates is the only man who has ever made him feel shame. I know that I cannot answer him or say that I ought not to do as he bids, Alcibiades says, his voice thick with wine and emotion. But when I leave his presence, the love of popularity gets the better of me, and therefore I run away and fly from him. And when I see him, I am ashamed of what I have confessed to him. Many a time have I wished that he were dead, and yet I know that I should be much more sorry than glad if he were to die. It is a heartbreaking admission. Alcibiades knew the good, but he could not choose it. He chose the applause of the crowd over the quiet questions of the master, and the crowd loved him for it, until they didn't. In 415 BCE, during a lull in the war, Alcibiades convinced the assembly to launch the most ambitious military operation in Greek history, the Sicilian expedition. It was a massive fleet sent to conquer the rich island of Sicily and expand the Athenian Empire. The city was swept up in a fever of greed and glory. But just days before the fleet was set to sail, Athens woke up to a shocking sacrilege. The Hermae, square stone pillars, topped with the head of the god Hermes, and featuring an erect phallus, which stood outside homes and temples as luck-bringers, had been mutilated. During the night, unknown vandals had chiseled off the faces and the phalluses of the gods. The city panicked. This was not a prank. It was a cosmic threat. Hermes was the god of travelers. To maim his statues before a naval journey was to invite shipwreck and death. Suspicion immediately fell on the drinking clubs of the wealthy youth, the same young men who spent their time debating with Socrates. And the finger pointed at Alcibiades. His enemies whispered that he had done it in a drunken rage or as a dark ritual to mock the democracy. Whether he was guilty remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. Historians still argue whether it was a frame-up by his political rivals or a genuine act of aristocratic hubris. But the damage was done. Alcibiades sailed for Sicily, but a recall order was sent to arrest him. Knowing that a trial in Athens meant death, the golden boy made a choice that stunned the world. He jumped ship. He did not go into exile. He went to Sparta. The betrayal was absolute. Alcibiades, the darling of Athens, stood before the grim elders of Sparta and offered them his services. He told them exactly how to defeat his homeland. Build a permanent fort at Decelia, he advised, pointing to a strategic hill in Attica. Do not just burn the crops in summer. Stay there year-round. Choke them. The Spartans listened. They built the fort, and Athens began to starve. The silver mines shut down. The slaves escaped. The pressure on the city became unbearable. Meanwhile, the great fleet in Sicily, the pride of the Athenian navy, was utterly destroyed. Thousands of Athenians died in the quarries of Syracuse, starved and beaten, or were sold into slavery. It was a catastrophe that broke the back of the city's power. Back in Athens, the grief turned to fury. Who was responsible for this monster? Who had taken this brilliant young man and taught him that tradition meant nothing? Who had taught him to question the gods and twist arguments to suit his own desires? The eyes of the grieving fathers turned to the teacher. They remembered seeing Socrates and Alcibiades walking together in the agora. They remembered the rumors of their closeness. They did not see a philosopher trying to tame a wild beast. They saw a corrupter who had unleashed a traitor. Socrates had not swung the sword or whispered the secrets to Sparta, but in the eyes of many, he had sharpened the mind that did. The tragedy of Alcibiades is that he proved Socrates' enemies right, even though Socrates had tried to prevent it. The critics of philosophy argued that teaching young men to question authority would lead to lawlessness. Socrates argued it would lead to virtue. Alcibiades was the living, breathing counterargument. He was the proof that intellect without morality is dangerous. And as the war dragged on, and the Spartan fort at Thessalia cast its long shadow over the starving city, the name of Alcibiades became a curse. Every time an Athenian mother looked at her empty cupboard, she cursed the traitor. And every time the politicians looked for someone to blame for the rot in the city's soul, their gaze drifted back to the old man in the worn cloak, the man who had been the traitor's friend. The web was tightening. The war, the plague, and now the treason. It was all leading to a single point of reckoning. But before the democracy could put Socrates on trial, it had to endure one final brutal humiliation: the death of freedom itself. The war did not end with a roar of defiance, but with the shrill, joyful sound of flutes. In 404 BC, after 27 years of bleeding, Athens surrendered. The Spartan admiral Lysander sailed into the Piraeus, and the starving city threw open its gates. The terms of defeat were humiliating. The great long walls, the stone limbs that had connected the city to the sea and sustained its power, were dismantled. Men and women climbed onto the rubble, pulling down the stones to the rhythm of music, while the Spartans declared that this day marked the beginning of freedom for Greece. But for Athens, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would make the war seem like a fond memory. The democracy, the chaotic, noisy, brilliant experiment of the people, was dissolved. In its place, the Spartans installed a board of 30 men to rewrite the laws and govern the state. They were called simply the 30. Later, history would give them a more accurate name: the 30 tyrants. The city fell silent. The assembly ceased to meet. The courts were closed. The noise of debate, which had defined Athens for a century, was replaced by the tramp of Spartan boots and the whisper of informers. The 30 set up their headquarters in the Tholos, the round building in the Agora that had once served as the dining hall for the Democratic Council. Now, it was the nerve center of a purge. At first, they arrested only the sycophants, the professional informers who had plagued the city during the democracy. The people, tired of corruption, nodded in approval. But terror is a hungry beast. It is never satisfied with just the guilty. Soon, the definition of enemy expanded. Wealthy resident aliens, known as metics, were arrested simply so their property could be seized to pay the Spartan garrison. Moderate citizens who dared to suggest that killing wasn't a sustainable policy were dragged from their homes. In a period of just 8 months, it is estimated that the 30 executed 1,500 Athenians, roughly 5% of the citizen population. To put that in perspective, imagine a government executing millions of its own people in less than a year. The blood did not flow on the battlefield. It flowed in the agora, in the prison cells, and from the cup of hemlock, which became the regime's favorite method of silencing dissent. And at the head of this machine of death stood a man named Critias. He was an aristocrat, a poet, a writer of tragedies, and a man of terrifying intellect. He was also, once again, a member of Socrates' inner circle. If Alcibiades was the fire that burned the city from the outside, Critias was the ice that froze it from within. He was Socrates' relative by marriage and had spent countless hours discussing virtue and definition with the philosopher. But where Socrates sought truth, Critias sought order, a brutal Spartan-style order where the strong ruled and the weak obeyed. He looked at the democracy and saw a mob. He looked at the oligarchy and saw perfection. The fact that the bloodiest tyrant in Athenian history was a known associate of Socrates was a public relations disaster that no amount of logic could fix. To the terrifying average citizen hiding behind his locked door, it looked as if Socrates was running a finishing school for dictators. Socrates, true to his nature, did not hide. He walked the streets of this occupied city just as he had walked the streets of the free one. He saw the terror, and characteristically, he made a joke about it, a dark, dangerous joke. He remarked to a friend that if a herdsman were to take a herd of cattle and make them fewer and thinner, he would be a poor herdsman. Yet the rulers of the city seemed unaware that they were proving themselves to be poor leaders by thinning the herd of citizens. The remark was reported to Critias. The tyrant summoned his old teacher. It was a chilling meeting. The student who had become the master of life and death facing the master of questions. Critias and his lieutenant, Charicles, forbade Socrates from speaking to the young or engaging in discussions. "You must leave the cobblers and the carpenters alone," Critias sneered. "They must be worn out by now from your talk." Socrates, unafraid, asked for clarification on the limits of this ban, tangling them in semantic knots until Charicles bluntly threatened him. "Watch out, Socrates, or you will make the cattle even fewer." The regime tried to make him complicit. In a gangster-like move to spread the guilt, the 30 ordered 5 prominent citizens to go to the island of Salamis, arrest a wealthy general named Leon, and bring him back for execution. It was a test of loyalty. To refuse was death. To obey was to become a murderer. 4 of the men went to Salamis. Socrates did not. He didn't argue. He didn't make a speech. He simply turned around and went home. It was a quiet, monumental act of defiance. He washed his hands of the regime, risking his life to keep his soul clean. "I care not a straw for death," he later said of this moment, "but my only care is to do nothing unjust or impious." He would have certainly been executed for this disobedience had the regime not collapsed shortly after. The end of the tyranny was as violent as its beginning. A band of democratic exiles, led by the patriot Thrasybulus, seized a fortress on the borders of Attica. They gathered strength, moving down to the port of Piraeus. A civil war erupted, street fighting in the dark, brothers killing brothers. In a decisive battle, Critias was killed, fighting with the desperate courage of a man who knows he has no future. The Spartans, seeing their puppet government fail, eventually withdrew support, and the democracy was restored. But it was a fragile, traumatized restoration. The survivors looked at each other with haunted eyes. Everyone had compromised. Everyone had lost someone. To heal the city, they passed an extraordinary law, the Act of Oblivion. It was an amnesty that forbade anyone from being prosecuted for crimes committed during the tyranny, with a few exceptions for the leaders. Citizens swore a solemn oath, "I will not remember the past wrongs." On the surface, Athens was at peace. The shops reopened, the courts convened. But you cannot legislate memory. The anger was still there, seething beneath the skin of the city, like an infection that had healed over on the surface but festered underneath. The Democrats, who had returned from exile, felt a righteous fury toward those who had stayed in the city under the 30. And though the amnesty protected Socrates from being sued for his association with Critias, it did not protect him from the court of public opinion. The Whisper Network was alive and well. Who taught Critias? They asked. Who taught Alcibiades? Who stayed in the city when the Democrats fled? The answer was always the same, the barefoot man with the bulging eyes. Socrates had survived the war, the plague, and the tyrants, but he was now an anomaly, a relic of a bygone era, a reminder of the intellectual arrogance that many believed had destroyed the city. The amnesty stopped them from charging him with being a teacher of tyrants. So, his enemies had to find another way. They had to find a charge that sounded religious, but felt political. They had to invent a crime that would allow the city to kill its conscience without breaking its own laws. The dust of the civil war has settled, but the air in Athens remains thin and brittle, charged with the static electricity of unexpressed rage. It is 399 BCE. The democracy has been restored, but do not imagine the jubilant, noisy freedom of the old days. This is a convalescent city. Athens is like a patient who has just survived a terrible fever, weak, hypersensitive to noise, and terrified of a relapse. The physical scars are everywhere. The long walls are still heaps of rubble. The olive groves are mere stumps, and the population has been decimated. But the invisible scars are deeper. Walk through the agora now, and you feel a strange, forced politeness. Men who fought on opposite sides of the barricades just months ago, one fighting for the tyrants, the other for the people, now pass each other in the street. They nod. They mutter a greeting. They do not draw knives. They are bound by the Act of Oblivion, a remarkable piece of legislation that legally forbids anyone from bringing up the crimes of the past. It is a desperate attempt to stitch the city back together by legislating collective amnesia. They have sworn a solemn oath. I will not remember. But memory is not a law you can repeal. Behind the closed doors of the courtyards, the resentment festers. The Democrats remember who stayed in the city and profited while they were starving in exile. They remember who the collaborators were, and though they cannot prosecute them for the past, they watch them with hawk-like intensity for any sign of new corruption. The city is gripped by a profound conservatism, not a political conservatism, but a survivalist one. When a society feels it has barely escaped destruction, it does not want innovation. It does not want clever paradoxes or new definitions of virtue. It wants the old gods. It wants the old laws. It wants the safety of the known. The Athenians are terrified that they have lost the favor of heaven. They look back at the plague, the defeat, and the tyranny, and they ask, what did we do to offend the gods? The answer, whispered in the assembly and the shops, is that they allowed sophistry and atheism to rot the city from within. They believe they were punished for being too clever, for allowing men to question the sacred traditions. To regain their strength, they believe they must purify the city. They must return to the faith of the fathers. In this atmosphere of anxious orthodoxy, Socrates stands out like a jagged rock in a calm pool. He has not changed. He is 70 years old now, a relic of the golden age, yet he seems immune to the mood of the times. He does not lower his voice. He does not stop his questioning. In fact, he seems more persistent than ever. To the nervous citizens, his continued presence is a provocation. It is as if he is saying, "You have learned nothing," or he is the living reminder of the intellectual culture that produced Alcibiades and Critias. He is the ghost at the banquet, the uncomfortable truth that the amnesty tried to bury. He walks among them, still barefoot, still poor, still dismantling the logic of anyone who dares to speak to him. But the men he is embarrassing now are not the arrogant imperialists of the past. They are the fragile rebuilders of the future. And they have no patience left. It is here that we must understand the why now question. Socrates had been annoying Athens for decades. Aristophanes had mocked him in the comedy The Clouds 24 years earlier. Why wait until he was an old man to kill him? Historians still argue whether the trial was a disguised political purge or a genuine religious panic. The answer, likely, is that the two cannot be separated in the Greek mind. To the Athenians, the political health of the city and the religious favor of the gods were the same thing. To threaten one was to threaten the other. Socrates was not just a political liability because his students became tyrants. He was a spiritual liability because his questions were seen as a kind of pollution. He was the pharmakos, the scapegoat. In ancient Greek rituals, when a city was in crisis, a scapegoat was sometimes chosen, fed, and then beaten or driven out to carry away the sins of the community. Athens felt dirty. It needed a cleansing. And Socrates, with his strange demonic voice and his rejection of traditional definitions, was the perfect vessel for their collective anxiety. Enter Anytus. If Socrates is the protagonist of this tragedy, Anytus is the antagonist. But do not make the mistake of seeing him as a cartoon villain. He was a hero. A wealthy tanner who had lost his fortune during the war, Anytus was a leader of the democratic resistance. He had risked his life to overthrow the 30 tyrants. He was a patriot who loved Athens with a fierce protective jealousy. But he was also a man of deep, rigid tradition. He believed that the only way to save the democracy was to restore the traditional values that had made it great. To Anytus, Socrates was not a harmless eccentric. He was a social cancer. Anytus had a personal stake in this too. His own son had been drawn to Socrates, and in Anytus's eyes, the boy had been ruined, turning away from the family business and the family values to chase after ideas. To Anytus, Socrates was a Pied Piper stealing the souls of the next generation. He represented the intellectuals who talked endlessly while the city burned. Anytus believed that for Athens to live, this dangerous questioning had to die. He did not act alone. He gathered 2 others to help him draft the indictment, creating a coalition that represented the breadth of Athenian anger. There was Meletus, a young, ambitious, and somewhat fanatical religious poet, representing the religious establishment that felt mocked by Socrates' rationalism. And there was Lycon, an orator, representing the rhetoric and public speakers Socrates had spent a lifetime ridiculing. Together, they were a formidable trio, the politician, the poet, and the orator. The very 3 groups Socrates had humiliated in his search for wisdom were now uniting to crush him. The legal strategy was cunning. Because of the amnesty, they could not charge Socrates with teaching Critias or being a friend of Alcibiades. Those were past crimes, covered by the oath of oblivion. So they had to frame his long-standing behavior as a current and ongoing crime. They had to prove that he was currently offending the gods and currently corrupting the youth. It was a loophole in the amnesty, a way to put the past on trial by dressing it up as the present. The whispers began to coalesce into a roar in the barber shops and the perfume stalls, the gossip centers of Athens. The talk was no longer about if Socrates would be stopped, but when. The safe space of the democracy was closing its borders to dangerous thoughts. The irony was palpable. The democracy that prided itself on isagoria, the equal right of speech, was preparing to silence a man for speaking. But fear makes hypocrites of us all. The Athenians convinced themselves they were not killing freedom. They were protecting it. They told themselves that Socrates was abusing the privilege of citizenship to undermine the city that granted it. One morning, the rumors became reality. Walking through the royal stoa, the portico where the king Archon, the magistrate in charge of religious affairs, held his court, a spectator would have seen a small papyrus document pinned to the notice board, or perhaps simply filed with the clerk. It was the formal indictment. The text was short, brutal, and terrifyingly vague. It read, "Socrates is guilty of not acknowledging the gods the city acknowledges, and of introducing other new demonic powers. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. Penalty proposed, death." The die was cast. The machinery of the state, rusty but functional, began to turn. The old man who had spent his life in the marketplace was about to face the ultimate market, the market of life and death, where the currency was persuasion and the cost of losing was total. Walk now to the northwest corner of the agora, where the shadows of the plane trees stretch long and cool against the limestone steps of the Stoa Basileos, the royal stoa. This is not a place of commerce, but of consequence. It is the office of the king Archon, the magistrate charged with overseeing the city's religious rites and ancestral laws. While Athens is a democracy, it has never quite shaken its memory of kings. They simply took the king's power, stripped it of political authority, and left it with the ceremonial duty to keep the gods happy. It is here, in the shadow of this open colonnade, that the fate of Socrates is sealed, not with a sword, but with a stylus pressed into wax. 3 men stand together, a tableau of the forces arrayed against the philosopher. In the center is Meletus. He is young, perhaps too young, for the gravity of what he is about to do. Plato describes him with a touch of disdain. A man with long, straight hair, a beard that struggles to be full, and a beak of a nose. He is a religious poet, fervent and possibly fanatical, the kind of man who sees a lack of piety not just as a difference of opinion, but as a personal insult to heaven. He is the face of the prosecution, the one who will stand up in court and shout the charges. But make no mistake, he is the puppet, not the master. Alone, Meletus is a nuisance. Supported by the others, he is a weapon. To his right stands Lycon, the orator. He represents the voice of the establishment, the smooth talkers, the men who make their living in the law courts and the assembly. He has been the target of Socratic irony more times than he cares to remember. Socrates has spent a lifetime proving that rhetoricians care more about persuasion than truth, more about winning than wisdom. Lycon is here to prove that persuasion is power. He is the aggrieved middle class, the man who is tired of being told that his success is hollow. But the true weight of the group, the gravity that anchors the accusation, comes from the third man, Anytus. He stands with his arms crossed, a man of wealth and hardened experience. He is a tanner by trade, owning a large workshop where slaves process hides into leather, a smelly but lucrative business that has made him one of the most powerful politicians in the restored democracy. Anytus is not a fanatic like Miletus, nor a wounded ego like Lycon. He is a pragmatist. He is a hero of the resistance who helped overthrow the 30 tyrants. He believes with a terrifying sincerity that he is saving Athens. He looks at his own son, a boy he wanted to bring into the family business, but who was entranced by Socrates' conversations. And he sees a wasted life. He sees the corruption of the youth, not as a legal theory, but as an empty chair at his own dinner table. Anytus provides the political cover. With his name attached to the suit, the jury will know this is not a frivolous prank. It is a defense of the state. Watch as they approach the clerk. The legal procedure is known as a graphe asabeas, a public indictment for impiety. Unlike a private lawsuit, dike, which concerns damages to an individual, a graphe concerns the welfare of the entire community. It is a high-stakes gamble. Athenian law has a built-in mechanism to prevent frivolous lawsuits. If the prosecutor fails to gain at least 1/5 of the jury's votes, he faces a crushing fine of 1,000 drachmas, enough to bankrupt a man and the permanent loss of his right to bring charges again. Miletus is betting his future on this. He takes the stylus and carves the words that will echo for 24 centuries. Miletus, son of Miletus of Pythias, indicts Socrates, son of Sophroniscus of Alopece. Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state, and of introducing other new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. The penalty demanded is death. The document is pinned to the notice board. Passers-by stop to read it. The buzz begins. New divinities? They whisper. What gods? This part of the charge is a direct attack on Socrates' famous daimonion, the divine sign, or internal voice he often spoke of. Socrates claimed that since childhood, a voice had come to him, always forbidding him from doing something, never commanding him to act. It was a check, a divine stop sign. To us, this sounds like a highly developed conscience. To the literal-minded Miletus, it sounded like Socrates was inventing his own private religion, bypassing the state priests and the official oracles. In a city where religion was a civic duty, having a private line to the divine was suspicious. It smelled of arrogance. It smelled of tyranny. News of the indictment travels fast. It reaches Socrates, likely as he is walking near the very same store. In a moment of supreme irony captured by Plato, and perhaps embellished, though the timing is historical, Socrates encounters an acquaintance named Euthyphro. Euthyphro is a self-proclaimed expert on religion who is at the courthouse for a shocking reason. He is prosecuting his own father for murder. He believes his piety is so perfect, his knowledge of the gods so exact, that he can violate the deepest taboos of family loyalty in the name of holiness. The contrast is absolute. Socrates, the impious man, is being sued for questioning the gods. Euthyphro, the pious man, is suing his own father because he thinks he knows exactly what the gods want. Socrates, with the twinkle in his eye that even the threat of death cannot extinguish, asks Euthyphro to explain piety to him. Since I am being charged with impiety, Socrates says, you, as an expert, must teach me what piety is so I can defend myself. And there, in the shadow of the courthouse, where his death warrant sits drying in the sun, Socrates launches into one of his typical examinations. He dismantles Euthyphro's confidence, exposing that the fanatic doesn't actually know if holiness is loved by the gods because it is holy, or holy because it is loved by the gods. Even at the door of death, Socrates cannot help himself. He is still the gadfly. He is still testing the horse. But the preliminary hearing, the anachrysis, is merely a formality. The king Archon accepts the charge. The date is set. The jury selection begins. This will not be a trial by a panel of judges, but by the dikastai, a massive slice of the Athenian citizenry. 6,000 citizens are empaneled for the year, and from this pool, 500, or perhaps 501, to prevent a tie, are chosen by lot for this specific case. These are not legal experts. They are farmers, shopkeepers, rowers from the fleet, old men who rely on the small daily juror's pay to buy bread. They represent the collective ID, the collective conscience, and the collective fear of the city. As the day approaches, friends urge Socrates to prepare. It was common practice to hire a logographos, a professional speechwriter, to craft a defense full of soaring rhetoric, tearful pleas, and flattering appeals to the jury's wisdom. Lysias, one of the most famous speechwriters of the day, reportedly offered to write a speech for Socrates. It would have been a masterpiece of persuasion. Socrates read it, nodded, and handed it back. "A fine pair of shoes, Lysias," he is said to have remarked, "but they do not fit my feet." He would not use the tools of the sophists. He would not manipulate. He would speak the truth, naked and unadorned, and let the chips fall where they may. He told his friends that he had a defense prepared his entire life. He had spent 70 years practicing justice. That would be his speech. The sun sets on the eve of the trial. In the house of Anytus, there is likely a grim satisfaction. The trap is set. In the house of Miletus, nervous pacing, the young man rehearsing his lines. And in the streets of Athens, the citizens argue. Is he a sage or a menace? Is he a victim or a villain? The city is about to put itself on trial along with the philosopher. The indictment is read, the wax is hard, and the stage is set for the most famous legal confrontation in the history of the West. The silence of the night deepens, heavy with the weight of the words that will be spoken at dawn. The sun has not yet cleared the peaks of Mount Hymettus, but the city is already awake, buzzing with a nervous, electric energy. Today is the day. Follow the stream of citizens flowing towards the agora, their sandals slapping against the stones. They are not heading to the market stalls to buy figs or salted fish. They are heading to the Heliaia, the Supreme Court of Athens. It is not a grand marble palace with vaulted ceilings and hushed corridors. It is a large, enclosed, open-air square, surrounded by low walls, filled with rough wooden benches. The ceiling is the sky itself, bright and indifferent. The floor is beaten earth. This is where democracy will perform its most dangerous ritual. Watch the crowd. It is a sea of male faces, weathered by the sun and the sea. These are the jurors, the dikastai. There are 500 of them, perhaps 501, an odd number chosen specifically to prevent a tie. They have not been hand-picked by a magistrate or selected for their legal expertise. They have been chosen by the most impartial force in the universe, chance. In the pre-dawn light, you can see the fascinating machinery of Athenian justice at work. Each potential juror holds a small bronze or wooden ticket, a Pinakion, stamped with his name and owl-headed seal. They slide these tickets into the slots of a massive stone machine called a Cleroterion. It looks like a monolith honeycombed with horizontal slots. A tube runs down the side, filled with black and white dice. As the dice fall, they determine which row of tickets, and thus which citizens, are selected for the day's duty. It is a complex, sophisticated system designed to prevent bribery. You cannot bribe a jury if you don't know who will be on it until the very last moment. And who are these men? Look closely at them as they file into the enclosure, clutching their staff of office. They are not the elite. The wealthy and the busy often avoided jury duty. They had estates to manage and symposiums to attend. These men are largely the elderly, the poor, the veterans of the long war. They are here partly for the civic honor, but also for the pay. 3 obols a day, enough to buy a modest meal and perhaps a little wine. The comic playwright Aristophanes called them wasps. Cantankerous, stinging, easily angered, and fiercely protective of their power. They settle onto the wooden benches, chatting, cracking nuts, perhaps smelling faintly of the garlic and bread they ate for breakfast. They are the city. They represent its prejudices, its fears, its common sense, and its volatility. There is no judge to direct them, no lawyer to interpret the law for them. They are the judge and the jury combined. They are the law. Into this arena walks Socrates. He is not in chains. He is not dragged by guards. He walks in with his usual rolling gait, wearing the same threadbare cloak he has worn for 20 years. He looks less like a defendant, fearing for his life, and more like a curious observer who has wandered into the wrong building. He takes his place on the beamer, the raised platform for the defense. Opposite him, on the prosecution's platform, stand his 3 accusers, the nervous Miletus, the slick Lycan, and the stern Anytus. The physical distance between them is small, but the philosophical distance is infinite. The atmosphere is not the solemn silence of a modern courtroom. It is the hum of a stadium before the game begins. The jurors know Socrates. Some have laughed at him in the plays. Some have seen him embarrassing their neighbors in the market. Some admire him. Many simply find him annoying. They lean forward, elbows on knees, ready to be entertained. In Athens, a trial is a spectator sport. It is a contest of rhetoric, a battle of words where style often counts as much as substance. To the side of the platforms stands a crucial device, the clepsydra or water clock. It consists of 2 clay vessels. Water drips from the upper jar to the lower one through a precisely sized hole. When the water runs out, the speaker must stop. There are no endless filibusters here. Justice is measured in drops. The prosecution will have a set amount of water to make their case, and Socrates will have an equal amount to defend himself. The water clock is the only neutral party in the room, a silent, dripping reminder that time is running out. Before a word is spoken, there is a ritual. A herald proclaims a curse upon anyone who would deceive the court or work against the democracy. The air is thick with the scent of burning incense, a reminder that this is a religious event as well as a legal one. The gods are watching. The irony, of course, is palpable. They are invoking the gods to judge a man accused of not believing in them. Historians still argue about the exact mood of the crowd that morning. Was it a lynch mob from the start? Or were they genuinely undecided? The voting records suggest a surprising division. Many jurors likely came with open minds, or or at least minds that could be swayed by a good speech. They expected Socrates to play the game. They expected him to bring his weeping wife and children to the stand, a standard Athenian defense tactic known as the miseratio, designed to tug at the heartstrings. They expected him to flatter them, to call them men of Athens, to praise their wisdom. They expected him to beg. But as Socrates stands there, scanning the rows of faces with those wide, protruding eyes, he does not look like a man preparing to beg. He looks like a man preparing to teach. He seems relaxed, perhaps even slightly amused by the absurdity of the situation. He knows the script they want him to read, and he has already decided to tear it up. He is not going to address them as a superior pleading with a superior. He is going to speak to them as an equal, or perhaps, dangerously, as a doctor speaking to a patient who doesn't know he is sick. The herald steps forward. Who wishes to speak? The formulaic question rings out. Meletus rises. The crowd quiets down. The crunching of nuts stops, and the rustling of robes ceases. The clerk pulls the plug on the water clock. Drip, drip, drip. The trial of the millennium has begun. The wind blows gently through the open enclosure, carrying the dust of the city into the court, mingling with the breath of 500 men who hold the power of life and death in their hands. The silence is heavy, waiting to be broken by the first stone of accusation. The water clock begins its steady, rhythmic dripping, marking the erosion of a man's life in seconds of falling water. Meletus stands on the prosecutor's platform, smoothing his robes, his knuckles white as he grips a scroll. He is the first to speak, and his voice, initially thin and reedy in the open air, gains strength as he feeds off the attentive silence of the 500 jurors. He does not begin with complex legal theories. He begins with fear. He paints a picture of a city besieged not by Spartans, but by doubt. He points a trembling finger across the gap at Socrates, who sits quietly, blinking in the sunlight, looking more like a confused uncle than a master criminal. Men of Athens, Meletus cries, his eyes scanning the crowd. This man is a maker of gods and a destroyer of tradition. The charge is a sebeia, impiety. To a modern ear, this sounds like a matter of personal conscience, a theological disagreement. But we must strip away our modern notions of religion to understand the terror this word evoked in the ancient heart. Greek religion was not about dogma. There was no Bible, no Quran, no set of commandments you had to believe in your heart. It was about orthopraxy, right action. It was a contractual relationship. You sacrificed the ox, you poured the wine, and the gods protected the city. It was a cosmic insurance policy. If one man stopped paying the premium, if one man insulted the insurers, the policy could be voided for everyone. The plague, the defeat, the tyranny, these were not seen as random accidents, but as evidence that the contract had been breached. Meletus argues that Socrates is the breach. He conflates Socrates with the natural philosophers, the meteorologists, who had been scandalizing Athens for decades. He claims Socrates teaches that the sun is not a god, but merely a red-hot stone, and that the moon is nothing but earth. He searches into things under the earth and above the heaven. Meletus accuses, invoking the stock caricature of the intellectual who dissects the divine until the magic is gone. Historians know that Meletus is actually confusing Socrates with Anaxagoras, a completely different thinker who had been exiled years before. Socrates had famously rejected the study of nature, preferring to study the human soul. But Meletus is not interested in accuracy. He is interested in recognition. He knows the jurors have seen Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, where a fictional Socrates floats in a basket and worships the damp air. Meletus is relying on a truthiness, a sense that, of course, this is what intellectuals do. They take the mystery out of the world and replace it with cold, hard matter. But the accusation goes deeper than just atheism. It twists into something stranger. Meletus attacks Socrates for introducing new demonic activities. This is a direct strike at Socrates' famous daemonion, the private voice that guided him. To Meletus, this is the ultimate arrogance. Religion in Athens is a public act. It happens at the altar, in the procession, in the open air where the city can see. For a man to claim a private, secret line to the divine is to bypass the state. It is a kind of spiritual treason. He creates his own gods, Meletus sneers, while rejecting the gods of our fathers. He listens to whispers in his head, but he closes his ears to the hymns of the city. The crowd murmurs. This resonates. They are suspicious of private things. They are suspicious of a man who stands alone. Meletus, sensing the momentum, presses harder. He argues that this spiritual independence is dangerous. If every man decided which gods to listen to, if every man decided to follow his own private sign instead of the laws, chaos would reign. He links Socrates' theology to the breakdown of order. He does not believe in the gods the city believes in. The phrase is carefully chosen. It's not just about existence. It's about allegiance. It's about joining the team. By questioning the myths, by asking, is this story true? Socrates is refusing to wear the team colors. Imagine the heat rising in the enclosure as the sun climbs higher. The jurors fan themselves with their ticket stubs. They look at Socrates. Does he look like an atheist? He has been seen praying. He has been seen offering sacrifices. But he does it differently. He prays for the good rather than for gold or victory. He treats the gods as moral paragons, not as the bickering, jealous superhumans of Homer's epics. Paradoxically, Socrates was perhaps more pious than his accusers. He believed the gods were too perfect to commit the immoral acts the poets ascribed to them. But in Athens, trying to purify the religion looked a lot like trying to destroy it. To say Zeus would not rape a mortal woman sounds like a compliment to Zeus, but to an Athenian raised on the myths, it sounds like you are calling Homer a liar. And if Homer is a liar, then who are we? Meletus wipes sweat from his brow. He is building a narrative of a man who thinks he is better than his city, a man who looks down on the simple faith of the people. He turns to the jury, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He thinks you are foolish, he implies. He thinks your rituals are empty. He mocks the very things that keep you safe. It is a powerful populist appeal. It frames the prosecution not as a persecution of an intellectual, but as a defense of the common man's dignity against an arrogant elite. Scholars often note the tragedy of this misunderstanding. Socrates' new gods were likely just his way of describing a conscience so refined it felt divine. He wasn't importing foreign deities. He was interiorizing religion. He was moving the temple from the Acropolis to the human heart. But Meletus, blinded by literalism and fear, sees only a threat. He checks the water clock. The water is running low. He has established the atmosphere of suspicion. He has painted Socrates as a stranger in his own city, a man whose mind is a foreign country. Now he must connect this spiritual rot to the physical destruction of the city's future. He pauses, takes a breath, and prepares to pivot to the second, more visceral charge, the one that will make the fathers in the audience clench their fists. He prepares to speak of the children. The accusation now shifts from the cold, distant realm of the heavens to the warm, intimate heart of the Athenian home. If the charge of atheism was a strike at the city's safety, the charge of corrupting the youth is a strike at its pride. The prosecutor's voice drops the theological abstractions and becomes visceral, personal. He is no longer talking about the sun and moon. He is talking about the dinner tables of the jurors. He is talking about the terrifying moment when a father realizes his son is no longer his own, but belongs to a new, alien world he cannot understand. He takes our sons, the accuser declares, his voice trembling with a genuine, resonant anger, and he turns them into strangers. This is the charge that makes the older men on the wooden benches lean forward, their knuckles whitening on their staffs. In ancient Athens, the family was not just a domestic unit. It was the primary school of virtue. A son was expected to emulate his father, to take up his trade, his politics, and his enemies. Respect for elders was the glue of the society. But for decades, a strange phenomenon had been occurring. Young men would go to the agora in the morning, dutiful and respectful, and return in the evening with a strange glint in their eyes and a quiver full of sharp, irritating questions. Imagine the scene repeated in 100 courtyards. A father, tired from a day in the fields or the workshop, sits down to his meal. He makes a traditional statement, perhaps complaining about a politician or praising a sacrifice. Suddenly, his son speaks up, not to agree, but to dissect. "But father," the boy says, mimicking the slow, deliberate cadence of Socrates, "you say that politician is bad. But by what standard do you judge the bad? And if you cannot define the good, how can you know its opposite?" The father is stunned. He sputters. He demands respect. The boy calmly replies that respect belongs to the truth, not to age. The father feels his authority crumbling, dissolved by a logic he cannot grasp. He feels humiliated in his own house, and he knows exactly who to blame. It is that barefoot man in the market, the Pied Piper of logic, who has taught the boy that his father is a fool. The prosecution brilliantly exploits a common confusion. They blur the line between Socrates and the sophists. The sophists were traveling teachers, intellectuals for hire, who charged exorbitant fees to teach wealthy young men the art of rhetoric, the ability to make the weaker argument appear the stronger. They were the spin doctors of the ancient world, relativists who taught that truth was subjective and that persuasion was the only reality. The average Athenian hated the sophists, seeing them as mercenaries who sold dangerous weapons to anyone with a purse. To the man in the street, Socrates looked exactly like a sophist. He hung around with young men. He talked about virtue. He split hairs. The subtle distinction that Socrates charged no money and claimed no knowledge, while sophists charged fortunes and claimed to know everything, was lost on the crowd. The prosecution argues that Socrates is the worst kind of sophist, one who teaches the youth to tear down tradition without building anything in its place. He teaches them to beat their fathers with words, the accuser cries, echoing a famous scene from Aristophanes' play, The Clouds, where a Socratic student literally beats his father while arguing that he is doing it for the Father's own good. The crowd ripples with recognition. They remember the laughter in the theater, but now the joke feels like a prophecy. Anytus, standing on the platform, embodies this grievance. Historical tradition hints that his own son, a bright lad capable of more than tanning hides, had been entranced by Socrates. Anytus had wanted him to be a businessman. Socrates had encouraged him to care for his soul. The boy, torn between the two, had reportedly fallen into idleness and drink, a personal tragedy that Anytus lays squarely at the feet of the philosopher. For Anytus, this is not theoretical. It is the theft of a legacy. The argument twists the knife deeper. The prosecution points to the company Socrates kept. Look at his students, they thunder. Look at Alcibiades. Look at Critias. They do not need to say the names loudly. The ghosts are already in the room. They argue that Socrates' method of questioning authority inevitably leads to the arrogance of the tyrant. By teaching young men that the majority is often wrong, that the herd is ignorant, and that only the expert in virtue should be listened to, Socrates was instinctively anti-democratic. He was breeding a wolf-pack of elitists who looked at the common people, the very people sitting in the jury box, with contempt. He teaches them that you are cattle, the implication runs. He teaches them that they are the shepherds. It is a damning narrative because it contains a kernel of truth. Socrates was critical of the democracy. He did mock the idea that wisdom could be found by counting heads. He did attract young aristocrats who looked down on the working masses. The prosecution weaves these facts into a tapestry of subversion. They claim he is the intellectual author of the city's suffering. The youth are the future, and Socrates has poisoned the well. If you let him live, they warn, he will infect the next generation and the next, until there is no one left who respects the gods or the laws. As the water in the clepsydra runs out, the prosecutor delivers his final blow. He appeals to the jurors' protective instincts. He asks them to be the fathers the city needs. Protect your sons, he urges. Silence the voice that confuses them. Restore the order of the house and the state. The final drops fall. The prosecutor steps back, his chest heaving, sweat staining his robes. A heavy silence descends on the court. The sun is higher now, beating down on the dust. The flies buzz in the stillness. The jurors shift on their benches. The case against Socrates is formidable. It appeals to their piety, their patriotism, and their paternal pride. It connects the dots between the strange philosopher and the terrible history of the last 30 years. It offers them a simple explanation for the city's decline. It is his fault. All eyes turn to the defendant's platform. Socrates stands up. He does not look like a monster. He does not look like a revolutionary. He looks old. He adjusts his cloak. He looks at the jury, then at his accusers, with a gaze that is neither fearful nor angry, but intensely curious. He clears his throat. The crowd waits for the famous voice, the voice that has charmed and infuriated Athens for half a century. They expect a defense. They expect him to explain away Alcibiades, to deny the new gods, to prove he is a good democrat. But Socrates has never done what was expected of him. He steps to the front of the bema. He does not begin with a plea for mercy. He begins with a correction of their grammar. The gadfly is about to bite. The water clock for the prosecution is empty. The last drops have evaporated into the dry heat of the Athenian morning. A heavy silence hangs over the court, a silence thick with the echoes of the accusations: atheist, corruptor, traitor. The 500 jurors shift their gaze to the old man standing on the defendant's platform. They expect him to tremble. They expect him to launch into a high-pitched, emotional denial, perhaps tearing his robe or throwing dust on his head. But Socrates does none of these things. He stands there, planting his bare feet firmly on the stone, and begins to speak. His voice is not the booming baritone of a trained orator, nor the shrill cry of a desperate man. It is a conversational voice, rumbly, calm, and startlingly ordinary. It is the same voice he uses to haggle for fish or discuss the nature of the soul in the gymnasium. He opens with a line of dry, devastating irony. I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost carried away by them, so persuasively did they speak. And yet, hardly a word of what they said is true. From the very first sentence, he breaks the rules. He refuses to address the jury with the customary flattering title, judges. He calls them merely men of Athens, reminding them that they are his peers, not his superiors. He refuses to use the flowery, stylized rhetoric of the law courts. He tells them plainly, you will hear from me the whole truth, but not in executed language like theirs. It is a risky strategy. The Athenians loved a good show. They loved the musicality of a well-crafted defense. By refusing to perform, Socrates is telling them that the truth is too important to be dressed up. He is serving them raw bread when they wanted cake. He divides his defense into two parts. First, he ignores Meletus entirely. He turns his attention to the old accusers, the shadows that have haunted him for decades. He addresses the rumors, the comedies of Aristophanes, the whispers in the street. These are my dangerous accusers, he says, because they got hold of you when you were children. Duh. He knows that the jury is not really judging him on the indictment written yesterday. They are judging the caricature of him they have carried in their heads for 30 years. The stargazer, the word twister. He gently mocks the idea that he has any knowledge of the heavens. I am not a scientist, he insists. I am just a man who asks questions. He asks the jury to look at one another. Is there anyone here who has ever heard me discuss physics or the clouds? The silence that follows is his first victory. Then he turns his gaze to Meletus. This is the moment the crowd has been waiting for, the elenchus, the cross-examination. In a standard trial, this would be a shouting match. With Socrates, it is a surgical dismantling. He invites Meletus to answer a few simple questions. Meletus, lightly sensing a trap, but unable to refuse in front of the crowd, reluctantly agrees. Socrates leads him down a garden path of logic. You say I corrupt the youth, Meletus. Tell me, who improves them? The laws, Meletus answers. But who applies the laws? The jurors here. All of them? Yes. And the audience? Yes. So, Socrates smiles, his eyes widening in mock amazement. It seems that every single person in Athens improves the youth, except for me. I alone corrupt them. That is very unlucky for me. A ripple of laughter moves through the crowd. The absurdity of Meletus's claim is suddenly naked. Socrates pushes further. He attacks the charge of atheism with a piece of logic so tight it squeaks. Meletus has accused him of believing in new demonic activities, his sign, while also being an atheist. Socrates bounces. Is it possible, Meletus, to believe in flute playing but not in flute players, to believe in horsemanship but not in horses? No. Then how can I believe in demonic activities if I do not believe in demons? And if I believe in demons, are they not either gods or children of gods? So you are saying, I believe in the children of gods, but not the gods themselves. That is like saying, I believe in mules, but not in donkeys or horses. Meletus is silent. He has been tied in a knot. Socrates dismisses him with a wave of his hand. He has proven the charges are incoherent, contradictory nonsense. In a legal sense, he has won. But Socrates knows this trial is not about logic. It is about emotion. It is about the hated name he has earned. And here, he makes the choice that seals his fate. He refuses to apologize for his life. A standard defense would involve a promise to change. I'm sorry, I was annoying. I'll stop questioning people. Socrates does the opposite. He doubles down. He tells the jury that his questioning is not a hobby. It is a divine command. He retells the story of the oracle, framing his entire life as a service to the god Apollo. God has posted me here, he says, using military terminology that resonates with the veterans in the audience. Like a soldier at his post. To desert my station because of fear of death would be truly impious. He looks at the jury, and for a moment, the old man seems to grow taller. Men of Athens, I honor and love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. It is a thunderclap of defiance. He tells them that even if they acquit him on the condition that he stops philosophy, he will refuse. While I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy. He tells them he will continue to go up to every man he meets, young or old, foreigner or citizen, and ask, are you not ashamed that you give your attention to acquiring as much money as possible, and similarly with reputation and honor, and give no attention or thought to truth and understanding and the perfection of your soul? This is the turning point. To some jurors, this is sublime courage. To others, it is unbearable arrogance. He is telling them to their faces that their lives are shallow. He is claiming moral superiority. He is daring them to kill him. Historians still argue whether Socrates was deliberately provoking a guilty verdict, a form of judicial suicide, or if he simply refused to compromise his principles, regardless of the cost. Xenophon, another student of Socrates, suggests that Socrates felt it was simply the right time to die, that old age was an uglier fate than execution. But reading Plato's account, one senses something more vibrant. A man who believes that the act of defense is more important than the result. He is not trying to save his skin. He is trying to save the soul of the city, even if it kills him. He moves to his final argument, the refusal to beg. He gestures to the empty space beside him. You see no weeping children here, he says, no wailing relatives. He acknowledges that many jurors probably have family members they could bring to evoke pity. He admits he has family too. 3 sons, 1 a teenager, 2 still children. But he will not parade them out. He calls such theatrics shameful for a city of Athens' reputation. A judge, he lectures them, is not here to grant favors as a gift, but to judge according to the laws. To try to manipulate them with tears would be to ask them to break their oaths. And that, he concludes, would be real impiety. The water in his clock is running low. He offers no grand peroration, no screaming finale. He simply hands his fate over to them and to the god. I commit my cause to you and to God, to be decided by you, as is best for you and for me. He sits down. The contrast is total. Meletus gave them heat. Socrates gave them light. Meletus gave them fear. Socrates gave them logic. But as the herald calls for the voting to begin, and the jurors line up to cast their ballots, there is a sense of unease. He has made them feel small. He has made them feel judged. And in the fragile, wounded democracy of Athens, no one likes to be judged, especially not by the man on trial. The bronze ballots clatter into the urns. The sound is like hail falling on a tin roof. The first act is over. Now, the city must decide. Socrates has refused to beg. He has dismantled the charges with logic and dismissed the prosecutors with irony. But he is not finished. He senses the mood in the enclosure, the irritation, the shifting of feet, the collective grumble of 500 men who feel they are being condescended to by a pauper. They see him as a nuisance, a pest, a needless interruption to the serious business of rebuilding the city. Socrates knows this, and in a moment of supreme rhetorical genius, he takes that very feeling, their annoyance, and transforms it into a divine mandate. He gives them an image that will outlast the stone walls of the courthouse, a metaphor so perfect that it has become the permanent definition of the philosophical life. Men of Athens, he says, his voice taking on a slightly lighter, almost playful tone, though the message is deadly serious. I am not arguing for my own sake, as you might think, but for yours, that you may not sin against the God by condemning me, who am his gift to you. The crowd must have scoffed. A gift? This snub-nosed, annoying old man who makes them feel stupid in front of their children is a gift from Apollo. It sounds like the height of arrogance. But Socrates presses on, painting a picture that every man in the jury, many of whom were farmers or cavalrymen, would instantly understand. For if you kill me, you will not easily find another like me. I was attached to this city by the god, though it seems a ridiculous thing to say, as upon a great and noble horse, which was somewhat sluggish because of its size and needed to be stirred up by a kind of gadfly. The metaphor is startlingly vivid. The great and noble horse is Athens itself. It is a compliment, but a backhanded one. He acknowledges the city's power, its pedigree, its grandeur, but he diagnoses its fatal flaw, lethargy. Not physical laziness. The Athenians were famously energetic, but intellectual and moral sluggishness. The city had become so big, so successful, so sure of its own greatness, that it had stopped thinking. It moved on instinct. It relied on tradition. It was sleepwalking through history, drifting toward cliffs it couldn't see because its eyes were half closed with self-satisfaction. And Socrates? He is the oistros, the gadfly. In the heat of the Greek summer, the horsefly is a terror to livestock. It buzzes relentlessly. It lands on the soft, sensitive skin where the tail cannot flick. It bites. It draws blood. It startles the animal, making it stomp and shudder. It is undeniably annoying, but, and this is the crucial point, it keeps the horse awake. It prevents the beast from settling into a stupor. It is to just such a task that I believe the god has appointed me to the city. Socrates continues, I never cease to rouse each and every one of you, to persuade and reproach you all day long, and sitting upon you everywhere. He is telling them that his annoyance is an act of love. When he stops a general and asks him to define courage, he is not trying to humiliate him. He is trying to wake him up. when he questions a politician about justice, he is stinging the sluggish mind into action. He is forcing the city to examine itself, to justify its beliefs, to actually think rather than just react. He argues that a democracy without dissent, without this constant irritating questioning, is a dead democracy. It is a sleeping horse waiting for the wolves. This is a profound political theory wrapped in a farmyard joke. Socrates is arguing that the true patriot is not the one who flatters the state, but the one who criticizes it. The flatterer lets the horse sleep. The patriot wakes it up, even if he gets kicked for his trouble. He is redefining the role of the citizen. Citizenship is not just about voting or fighting. It is about thinking, and thinking is painful. It hurts to realize you are wrong. It hurts to have your cherished beliefs punctured. The sting of the gadfly is not a metaphor for physical pain, but for the psychic pain of cognitive dissonance. You will not easily find another like me, he warns them, with a lack of false modesty that is almost charming. He points to his own poverty as proof of his sincerity. A man who does this for money or power would have quit long ago. A man who does this for ego would have dressed better. My poverty is a witness to my truth, he says. He has neglected his own affairs, his own family, to serve them. He is a volunteer nuisance, a pro bono irritant sent by heaven. But then the tone darkens. He anticipates their reaction. He knows that when you wake a sleeping giant, its first instinct is not gratitude, it is rage. You may feel irritated at being awakened in the night, he says, and you may swat me and kill me easily, as Anytus advises. And then you can sleep on for the remainder of your lives, unless God in his care for you sends you another gadfly, and then you can sleep on. It is a chilling line. He is offering them a choice between the difficult, irritating life of awareness and the comfortable, deadly silence of conformity. He is telling them that if they kill him, they are not solving a problem. They are turning off the alarm clock. They are choosing the sleep of the graveyard. The jury listens, and the reaction is mixed. Some surely see the nobility of it. They recognize the truth in his words, that Athens has become arrogant, that it has made mistakes. But for many others, the metaphor backfires. Who likes a gadfly? No one. You don't coexist with a gadfly. You crush it. By comparing himself to a pest, Socrates has given his enemies the perfect image to justify his removal. You don't put a gadfly on trial. You swat it. Furthermore, the claim that he is a gift from God rubs the pious Anytus the wrong way. It sounds like the delusion of a megalomaniac. He thinks he is the only one who keeps Athens alive, they mutter. Does he think the laws, the navy, and the temples are nothing without his pestering? Socrates has misread the room. Or perhaps he has read it perfectly and simply doesn't care. He is not trying to win an acquittal by soothing them. He is trying to win the argument by provoking them. He is stinging them one last time, right there in the courtroom. He is forcing them to decide. Do we want to be awake, or do we want to be comfortable? As he steps back from the edge of the platform, the buzzing of the wasps, the jurors, grows louder. They are insulted. They are tired. The sun is hot, and this old man is telling them that they are lazy beasts who owe him a debt of gratitude for bothering them. It is a bold, beautiful, and suicidal strategy. He has staked his life on the belief that Athens is still capable of recognizing the truth. even when it hurts. He is betting that the horse is noble enough to tolerate the fly. But as the herald prepares the urns for the first vote, the mood is not one of gratitude. It is one of impatience. The gift of God is about to be returned to sender. The jurors stand up, clutching their bronze ballots. One is solid, for acquittal. One has a hollow stem, for conviction. They hold the stems between their thumb and forefinger, so no one can see which way they are voting. The secret ballot, the jewel of Athenian liberty. They walk past the urns, dropping the metal discs with a clatter. Clang, clang, clang. The sound of democracy working, the sound of a city making up its mind. Socrates sits and watches. He seems detached, almost serene. He has said what he needed to say. He has stung the horse. Now he waits to see if it will wake up or if it will simply roll over and crush him. The counting begins. The ballots are poured out onto a counting board. The clerks separate the solid from the hollow. The piles grow. It is going to be close. The gadfly has not convinced everyone, but he has touched some. The fate of wisdom hangs on a handful of bronze discs, piling up in the dust. The sound of the last bronze ballot hitting the urn echoes like a dropped coin in an empty room, signaling the end of the city's deliberation. The herald steps forward, signaling the officials to begin the count. This is the moment where philosophy crashes against the hard arithmetic of democracy. The urns are tipped. The bronze discs spill onto the counting boards, a metallic cascade of judgment. In the breathless heat of the afternoon, the only sound is the scraping of metal against wood as the clerks separate the hollow stems from the solid ones. The hollow discs are the black pebbles of guilt, the solid ones, the white stones of innocence. Watch the piles grow. It is a visual tug-of-war. The pile for conviction rises quickly, fueled by the angry speeches of Anytus and the deep-seated fears of the conservative farmers. But look at the other pile. It is rising too, far higher than anyone expected. The young men, the intellectuals, the citizens, who remember Socrates' bravery at Delium, and perhaps those who simply admire his sheer nerve. They are voting for him. The clerks count in hushed tones, grouping the discs by tens and hundreds. The air in the enclosure is thick with suspense. This is not the crushing landslide the prosecution hoped for. It is a razor's edge. Finally, the herald raises his staff. The numbers are announced. The total vote is cast. Out of 500 jurors, roughly 280 have voted for guilt. 220 have voted for acquittal. A murmur runs through the crowd, a sound of shock, not triumph. It is a guilty verdict, yes, but by a margin so slim, it feels like a moral defeat for the accusers. Do the math in the dust. If only 30 men had switched their votes, just 30 individuals out of 500, Socrates would be walking free. In a city of thousands, the life of the most famous man in Greece hangs on the whim of a group small enough to fit in a single tavern. Socrates stands up to respond to the verdict. He does not look devastated. If anything, he looks genuinely amused. He peers at the piles of bronze with a scientific curiosity, as if analyzing the results of an experiment. Men of Athens, he says, his voice steady and devoid of bitterness. I am not grieved by the result of the voting. He confesses that he expected a much larger margin against him. He assumed the prejudice of decades would bury him under a mountain of hollow discs. As it is, he notes with a wry smile, a switch of only 30 votes would have saved me. He turns his gaze to Meletus. The young prosecutor is likely pale, sweating despite his victory. He knows how close he came to disaster. Under Athenian law, if a prosecutor failed to get at least 1/5 of the vote, he would face a crushing fine and dishonor. Socrates points this out, twisting the knife of irony one last time. Meletus, it seems, has barely escaped the fine, he jokes. It is a moment of levity in the face of doom, a reminder that Socrates refuses to take the game as seriously as the players. He treats the verdict not as a condemnation of his soul, but as a statistical curiosity of the city's mood. But now the mood of the court shifts. The trial is not over. In the Athenian legal system, a conviction is merely the first act. Now comes the timesis, the assessment of the penalty. The law for impiety does not mandate a specific punishment. The jury must decide. The procedure is a negotiation. The prosecution proposes a penalty. The defense proposes a counter penalty. The jury must then vote again to choose between the two. They cannot compromise. They cannot choose a middle ground. It is an either/or choice designed to force both sides toward moderation. If the prosecutor asks for something too harsh, the jury will choose the defense's milder option. If the defense asks for something too lenient, the jury will be forced to choose the prosecutor's harshness. Meletus stands again. He has been bruised by the narrowness of the vote, and he needs to reassert his authority. He does not hesitate. He does not offer a fine or imprisonment. He demands the ultimate price. Death, he says. The word hangs in the air, heavy and final. There is no gasping this time. It was written on the indictment, but spoken aloud, with the piles of voting discs still visible. It has a terrifying weight. Now all eyes turn to Socrates. The strategy is obvious. To save his life, he must offer a punishment that is substantial enough to satisfy the jury's anger, but livable enough to accept. Exile is the standard move. If Socrates offers to leave Athens and never return, the jury will almost certainly accept it. They don't really want to kill an old man. They just want him to shut up. Banishment solves the problem perfectly. It removes the gadfly without the stain of blood. Alternatively, a heavy fine paid by his wealthy friends like Plato and Crito would likely suffice. The jurors are poor. They understand the pain of parting with money. Socrates pauses. He looks at the jury, then at the sky, then back at his accusers. He knows the game. He knows that if he proposes exile, he lives. But he also knows that to propose a punishment is to admit guilt. To say, I deserve to be fined, is to say, I did something wrong. And Socrates, stubborn, brilliant, and maddeningly consistent to the end, refuses to concede an inch of his soul to save his body. He is about to make the most audacious counterproposal in legal history, a move so shocking that it will turn the sympathy of the near-miss vote into a landslide of rage. He steps forward, clears his throat, and prepares to tell the city exactly what he thinks he is worth. The silence in the court is now the silence of a held breath. The 500 jurors lean forward, their hands resting on their knees, waiting for the capitulation. They have seen this play 100 times before. The proud man is humbled. The defiant voice cracks. Socrates has been found guilty, and now, to save his skin, he must play the part of the contrite loser. The script is written in stone. He should propose exile. He should offer to pack his few belongings, take his nagging questions, and vanish into the mists of Thessaly or Megara. The jury is ready to accept this. In fact, they want it. They don't want his blood on their hands. They just want his voice out of their ears. A vote for exile would be a relief, a way to wash the city clean without the stain of execution. Even Anytus, the archconservative, would likely nod and let the old man go. But Socrates stands on the bema with a terrifying tranquility. He looks at the jury not as men who hold his life in their hands, but as students who have failed a test and need one final remedial lesson. He begins to speak, and his logic is as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "What do I deserve to suffer or to pay?" he asks, stroking his beard. "I, who have not kept quiet during my life, who have neglected what most men care for, money-making, household affairs, generalship, public speaking, and all the other offices and plots and parties that happen in the city." He runs through the list of things he is not. He is not a politician. He is not a businessman. He is, he claims, a benefactor. He has spent his life approaching each citizen like a father or an older brother, persuading them to care for virtue more than wealth. So the question is not what punishment fits a criminal, but what treatment fits a benefactor who happens to be poor and needs leisure to continue his work. The jury blinks. Is he serious? Is he really arguing that his crimes were actually serfs? "There is nothing more fitting, men of Athens," Socrates continues, his voice rising slightly with a note of genuine sincerity that sounds to the crowd like utter madness, "than for such a man to be fed in the Prytaneum." A gasp ripples through the enclosure. It starts in the front rows and spreads like a wave of physical shock. The Prytaneum. This was the sacred heart of the city, the town hall where the holy fire of Hestia burned day and night. To be granted free meals there, cytises, was the highest honor Athens could bestow. It was reserved for the descendants of tyrannicides, for foreign dignitaries, and for the victors of the Olympic Games. It was the ancient equivalent of a ticker-tape parade and a lifetime pension combined. Socrates is looking them in the eye and saying, "You want to punish me? My punishment should be that you honor me like an Olympian." For the Olympian victor makes you seem happy, Socrates explains, twisting the knife of his logic. "But I make you be happy. He does not need the food, but I do." To the average juror, a rower from Piraeus or a farmer from Achane, this is not just arrogance, it is blasphemy. It is a slap in the face of the court. Here is a man convicted of a capital crime, and he is demanding the hero's portion. It feels like he is mocking the entire legal process, treating the threat of death as a joke. But historians argue that Socrates was not joking. He was trapped by his own relentless honesty. To propose a punishment like a fine or imprisonment would be to admit he had done something wrong. He believed he had done good. Therefore, the only logical penalty was a reward. He was unwilling to lie to save his life. He was putting consistency above survival. Seeing the anger rising in the crowd, the wasps are beginning to buzz with fury now. Socrates shifts gears. He addresses the option everyone is waiting for: exile. Perhaps, he muses, you might say, "Socrates, can't you just go away and keep your mouth shut?" This is the exit door. He just has to walk through it, but he slams it shut. He explains that if he cannot survive in Athens, the city that raised him and knows him, he certainly won't survive among strangers. If I drive away the young men, they will persuade their elders to expel me. If I don't drive them away, their fathers and relations will expel me for their sakes. He knows he is a gadfly. He cannot stop buzzing just because he crosses a border. But the deeper reason is theological. If I say that to be quiet is to disobey the God, you will not believe me and will think I am being ironic. He looks at them with a kind of desperate intensity. But this is the truth. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. There it is, the core of his soul, laid bare in 8 words. The unexamined life is not worth living. He is saying that simply breathing, eating, and sleeping is not being human. To be human is to question. To stop questioning is to die. So if they force him into an exile where he cannot question, they are killing him anyway. He chooses the death of the body over the death of the mind. Finally, bowing to the pressure of his friends, who are likely frantic by now, pulling at his cloak, whispering furiously, Socrates agrees to propose a financial penalty. But even this is done with a touch of Socratic absurdity. I have no money, he shrugs. I could perhaps pay 1 mina of silver. 1 mina. It is a pittance, about 100 drachmas. It is perhaps 1/5 of the cost of a good slave. To the jury, it sounds like he is pricing his life at the cost of a used mule. It is an insult. Suddenly, there is a commotion near the defense platform. Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, the wealthy young aristocrats who love him, are standing up. They are shouting numbers. They are frantically pledging their own fortunes to save their teacher from his own poverty. Socrates listens to them, nods, and turns back to the jury. Plato here, and Crito, and Critobulus, and Apollodorus bid me propose 30 minae, and they will stand surety for it. So I propose that amount. 30 minae is a substantial sum, years of wages for a working man. It is a respectable offer. If he had led with this, or if he had offered exile first, he might have lived, but the damage is done. The image of the hero's meal in the Prytaneum cannot be unseen. The insult cannot be unheard. He has shown them that he does not respect their power. He has treated the court of Athens not as a terrifying tribunal, but as a room full of confused children who need to be corrected. The jurors are furious. They feel he is goading them. In a culture based on time, honor, Socrates has just shamed them. He has forced them into a corner. If they accept the fine now, they look weak. They look like they let an arrogant old man dictate terms. He has turned the vote from a question of justice into a question of pride. The herald calls for the second vote. The atmosphere has changed completely. The hesitation of the first vote is gone. The sympathy for the eccentric old veteran has evaporated, replaced by a cold desire to silence this arrogance once and for all. The wasps are swarming. They stand up, clutching their ballots, their faces set in grim lines. They are not voting to protect the gods anymore. They are voting to protect their own dignity. Socrates watches them with his usual calm, perhaps knowing that he has just signed his own death warrant, and perhaps, just perhaps, being perfectly content with that. The clatter of the bronze discs begins again, but this time it sounds less like a deliberation and more like a door slamming shut. The bronze discs have ceased their clattering, and the silence that descends upon the court is heavy, suffocating, and final. The clerks have finished their grim arithmetic. The result is announced not with a shout, but with a ripple of murmurs that spreads from the front rows to the back like a wind moving through dry wheat. The verdict is death, but it is the numbers that tell the true story of the afternoon, a story of pride wounded and patience snapped. In the first vote, The margin was razor thin. A mere 30 votes separated Socrates from freedom. But now, in the second vote, the numbers have shifted violently. A significant block of jurors, perhaps as many as 80 men, who had originally voted to acquit him, have now switched sides to vote for his execution. Think about that for a moment. These men believed he was innocent of the charges. They believed he was not a corrupter, not an atheist. But his counterproposal, his audacious request for free meals in the Prytaneum, followed by the insulting offer of a pittance, offended them more than his alleged crimes ever did. They did not vote to kill a criminal. They voted to kill a nuisance. They voted to silence a man who refused to pretend, even for a moment, that they had power over his soul. It was an emotional lashing out, a collective tantrum of the state against an individual who simply would not bend the knee. Socrates stands to speak one last time. Under Athenian procedure, the convicted man is allowed a few final words, while the magistrates wait to escort him away. Most men in this position would be dragged off weeping, or would scream curses at their judges. Socrates does neither. He seems, if anything, lighter. The burden of the trial is gone. The uncertainty is over. He has stayed true to himself, and the result is now out of his hands. He turns first to those who voted for his death. He does not look at them with hatred, but with a kind of pitying prophecy. You think that by killing me, you can avoid the accuser who is censure, he tells them, his voice calm and level. But you are mistaken. He warns them that they have not solved their problem. They killed him to stop the questioning, to stop the painful examination of their lives. But he predicts that others will come, younger, fiercer men who have been listening in the shadows. They will be more difficult to deal with, he warns, because they are younger, and you will be more annoyed. It is a chilling prediction. He is telling them that they are cutting off the head of a hydra. By making him a martyr, they are ensuring that Socratic questioning will not die with his body. It will become a movement. He tells them, with the wisdom of a man standing on the threshold of eternity, that the only way to escape criticism is not to silence the critic, but to live a life that does not deserve criticism. If you think that by killing men you can prevent someone from censuring your evil lives, you are mistaken. Then he turns to the other group, the men who voted for his acquittal. He calls them judges, using the respectful title he refused to use earlier, because they have truly judged with their consciences. He wants to comfort them. He tells them a remarkable thing. His divine sign, the daimonion, that has opposed him in small matters all his life, remained completely silent today. It did not stop him from leaving his house. It did not stop him when he began to speak. It did not check him when he refused to beg. This silence, he explains, is a proof that what has happened to me is a good, and that those of us who think that death is an evil are in error. If death were truly bad, the divine voice would have warned him. Its silence is a green light. It is an assurance that he is walking the right path. And here, facing the abyss, Socrates offers his final beautiful meditation on death. He takes the terror that has haunted humanity since the beginning of time and dissects it with his logic, holding it up to the light until it looks less like a monster and more like a gift. Death is one of two things, he muses. Either it is a state of nothingness and utter unconsciousness, or, as men say, there is a change and migration of the soul from this world to another. If it is the first, a dreamless sleep, then death is a blessing. We all know the sweetness of a night so deep that no dreams disturb us. We wake up refreshed. To have all of eternity be like that single night. I say that to die is gain, he says. It is a rest from the weariness of the world, a final curing of the fever of life. There is a profound softness in this idea, a lullaby for the self. But if it is the second, if the myths are true and death is a journey to Hades, then Socrates' eyes light up with a mischievous glee. For him, the afterlife is not a place of judgment, but a place of conversation. What would not a man give if he might converse with Orpheus and Musaeus and Hesiod and Homer, he asks. He imagines meeting the great heroes of the Trojan War, Palamedes, Ajax, Agamemnon. But he doesn't want to worship them. He wants to cross-examine them. He wants to find the leader of the great expedition and ask, what is leadership? He wants to find Sisyphus and ask, is the rock heavy or is your mind heavy? He jokes that the best part of Hades is that the residents there are immortal, so they can't kill him for being annoying. He will be able to ask questions for eternity, safe in the realm of the dead. It is a moment of transcendent humor. Even in his vision of hell, Socrates is still Socrates. He cannot imagine a paradise that does not involve the search for truth. The sun is dipping lower now, casting long shadows across the agora. The 11, the police magistrates of Athens, are waiting. The water clock is dry, the bronze ballots are bagged, the show is over. Socrates looks at his friends, Plato, Crito, Apollodorus, who are weeping openly. He admonishes them gently. He has no fear. He has lived his life exactly as he intended. He has compromised nothing. He has not sold his soul for a few more years of breathing in a body that is already failing. He is leaving as a victor, not a victim. He speaks his final sentence to the court, a sentence that has echoed through every philosophy classroom for 2,000 years. It is perfectly balanced, humble, and devastatingly ambiguous. The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways, I to die, and you to live. Which is better, God only knows. With that, he steps down from the beamer. He does not look back. He allows the 11 to surround him. They are not rough with him. There is a strange respect in the air, a sense that they are escorting a dignitary rather than a criminal. The crowd parts. The jurors file out, some vindicated, some ashamed, all of them exhausted. The noise of the trial fades, replaced by the everyday sounds of the city. A dog barking, a cartwheel squeaking, a mother calling her child. Life in Athens goes on. The fish are sold, the bread is baked, the politics continue. But something has changed. A light has been put out, or perhaps, as Socrates predicted, a torch has been passed. As he is led away towards the prison, which lies just a few hundred yards to the southwest of the court, the reality of the sentence begins to settle. In Athens, executions were usually carried out immediately. A man condemned at noon would be dead by sunset. The hemlock was ground, the cup prepared, and the deed done before the stars came out. The jurors go home expecting that, by the time they eat their evening meal, the old philosopher will be a memory. But fate, or perhaps Apollo, has one last twist in store. The winds of the Aegean are blowing, and a ship with a sacred wreath on its prow is missing from the harbor. The calendar of the gods is about to interfere with the calendar of men. Socrates will not die today. He will not die tomorrow. He is about to enter a strange twilight period, a suspended animation where he will live on as a prisoner, holding court in a cell, waiting for a ship that seems determined to take its time returning from the holy island of Delos. The trial is over. But the dying will be a long, slow conversation. The sun sets on the day of the trial, casting the Acropolis in silhouette against a bruised purple sky. The crowds disperse from the agora, their sandals kicking up the cooling dust, their voices lowered in the aftermath of the verdict. In the homes of Athens, the oil lamps are lit, and the talk over wine and watered-down vinegar is all about the old man. Most assume the story is over. In the brutal rhythm of Athenian justice, the path from the courtroom to the grave is usually a short, straight line. The 11, the magistrates responsible for prisons and executions, are efficient men. Normally, the hemlock is ground, the cup is mixed, and the condemned man drinks it as the sun goes down, ensuring the city is not polluted by the presence of a living criminal for another day. But as the guards lead Socrates toward the Desmoterion, the state prison, a modest building nestled in a depression near the marketplace, a strange hush has fallen over the harbor of Piraeus. History, it seems, has a sense of irony. Or perhaps the gods are not quite done with their gadfly. The execution cannot happen today. It cannot happen tomorrow. In fact, for the next 30 days, the hands of the executioner are tied by a thread of ancient myth. Just the day before the trial, a specific ship had been prepared in the harbor. The priest of Apollo had walked to the water's edge and solemnly placed a wreath of laurel upon the stern of the vessel. This simple act triggered a sacred law that superseded all others. The ship is the Theoria, the sacred vessel sent annually to the holy island of Delos. Its voyage is a pilgrimage of thanksgiving, a ritual that reaches back into the deep, misty time of legends. The Athenians believed that centuries ago, their ancestors were forced to send a terrible tribute to King Minos of Crete. 7 young men and 7 young women to be devoured by the Minotaur in the labyrinth. The hero Theseus, the mythical founder of the Athenian state, volunteered to go. He vowed to Apollo that if he slew the beast and saved the youths, the city would send a holy mission to Delos every year to offer thanks. Theseus succeeded. The Minotaur fell, and for 1,000 years, Athens had kept its promise. During the time this sacred ship is away, from the moment the wreath is placed until the moment it returns to the dock, the city of Athens must remain ritually pure. No public executions are allowed. The state cannot take a life while it is thanking the god for saving lives. It is a profound paradox. The city is too pious to execute a man during the holy month, yet it is executing him for impiety. The law of the ritual is strict, but the winds of the Aegean are fickle. Sometimes the voyage takes a week. Sometimes, if the headwinds are strong, it takes a month. And so Socrates enters a strange, suspended twilight. He is a dead man walking, yet he is granted a reprieve that depends entirely on the caprice of the sea and the breath of the wind. The prison itself is not a dungeon of Gothic nightmares. There are no dripping walls or torture racks. Archaeological excavations in the southwest corner of the agora have revealed a building that fits the description. A central courtyard surrounded by small cells facing the street. It is a porous place. The door is guarded, but not sealed. By day, the shackles are often removed or loosened, and because this is Athens, where conversation is as necessary as bread, the prison becomes a kind of philosophical salon. Socrates' friends, Crito, Phoido, Antisthenes, and others, are allowed to visit him every single day. They arrive at dawn, waiting for the doorkeeper to unlock the gates, often bribing him with a few obols to get in early. They stay until sunset, turning the cell into a lecture hall, a confessional, and a sanctuary of friendship. Imagine the scene inside. Socrates sits on a simple wooden bench, rubbing his legs where the iron fetters have chafed the skin. He is 70 years old, yet his mind is as agile as a gymnast. He does not spend his time weeping or cursing the jury. He spends it working. In a fascinating detail recorded by Plato, Socrates reveals that he has had a recurring dream throughout his life. A figure appears to him and says, "Socrates, make music and work at it." For years, he interpreted this to mean philosophy, which he considered the highest form of music, the harmony of logic and life. But now, facing the end, he wonders if he should take the command literally, just in case. So, in the quiet hours of his imprisonment, the man who famously wrote nothing begins to write. He takes the fables of Aesop, the stories of foxes and grapes, of ants and grasshoppers, and turns them into verse. He composes a hymn to Apollo. He spends his final days strictly obeying the god of music, ensuring his soul is tuned perfectly before it leaves the instrument of his body. The atmosphere in the cell is a mix of deep sorrow and surreal cheerfulness. His friends are devastated. They cry, they pace, they plot. But Socrates is the one comforting them. He jokes about the delay. He treats the arrival of the ship not as a ticking clock of doom, but as a neutral fact of geography. "The ship will arrive when it arrives," he says. He sleeps soundly, so soundly that Crito often sits by his bed for hours, watching him breathe, marveling that a man so close to death can sleep like a baby. Meanwhile, the city outside continues its business. The wasps of the jury go back to their farms. The politicians go back to the assembly. But there is an uneasiness in the air. The ship is out there, somewhere in the Cyclades, battling the Meltemi winds. Every day, lookouts on the cliffs of Sunion scan the horizon for the white sails of the sacred vessel. Every day it does not appear is another day the city has to live with its decision. The delay allows the guilt to set in. It allows the heat of the moment to cool, leaving behind the cold ash of regret. Some of the men who voted for death begin to wish they hadn't. The silence of the prison becomes louder than the noise of the trial. Historians still debate the exact length of this imprisonment, but most agree it lasted about 30 days. 30 days of stolen time. 30 days for the Socratic circle to cement their loyalty and their grief. It was in this crucible of waiting that the legend of Socrates was truly forged. If he had died immediately, he would have been a victim. By living on for a month, cheerful and unafraid, he became a saint. He showed them that his philosophy was not just words for a sunny day. It was armor that held up in the dark. He demonstrated that a good man can be happy even in chains, even in the shadow of the executioner. One morning, the news arrives. A fishing boat from Sunion brings word. The sacred ship has been sighted. It has rounded the cape. The wind is filling its sails. It is gliding toward the Piraeus. The holy season is ending. The purity of the city is about to be restored, which means the impurity, the philosopher, must be removed. The timeline snaps back into focus. The sand in the hourglass is gone. But before the ship docks, before the sun rises on the final day, There is one last drama to be played out. In the grey pre-dawn hours, while the rest of the city is asleep, a figure slips into the prison. He carries a purse of heavy gold coins and a desperate plan. He is Crito, Socrates' oldest and most loyal friend, and he has not come to say goodbye. He has come to break him out. The guards have been bribed. The boat is waiting. The road to Thessaly is open. All Socrates has to do is stand up and walk out. The door to life is wide open. But Crito is about to discover that the hardest locks to break are not made of iron, but of principle. The sun has climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and the prison cell, usually a place of quiet waiting, begins to fill with visitors. The news has spread. The ship from Delos has docked. The sacred wreath has been removed. The ritual purity of the city is over, and the business of death can resume. The 11 have given the order. Today is the day. But this is not a day of solitary mourning. It is a gathering of the clan. Socrates' friends crowd into the small stone room. Phaedo, Simmias, Cebes, Crito, and others, men who have traveled from Thebes and Megara to be here for the final lesson. The mood is strange. Phaedo later recounts that he felt an unaccustomed mixture of pleasure and pain. It did not feel like a funeral. There was no wailing, no tearing of clothes. Socrates was sitting up, rubbing his leg where the irons had just been removed by the blacksmith, and marveling at the strange relationship between pleasure and pain. How singular is the thing called pleasure, he muses, massaging the red marks on his shin. It seems to be the twin of pain. They never come to a man together, but if you pursue one, you are compelled to take the other. The fetters hurt my leg, and now that they are gone, the pleasure follows. Even in his final hours, he is analyzing, observing, turning his own physical sensations into a philosophical puzzle. He is determined to die as he lived, thinking, but his friends are troubled by a deeper anxiety. They are about to lose their guide, their father figure in philosophy. The fear of death, not just for Socrates, but for themselves, hangs heavy in the room. They need reassurance. They need to know that this is not the end. And so, the conversation turns to the soul. Is it immortal? Does it survive the hemlock? Or does it disperse like smoke on a windy day? Simmias and Cebes, two Pythagoreans from Thebes, press him hard. They are not afraid to challenge him, even now. Socrates, they ask, how can we be sure? What if the soul is like the harmony of a lyre? When the lyre is broken, the harmony vanishes. What if the body breaks and the soul simply stops? Socrates does not dismiss their fears. He welcomes the challenge. He strokes Phaedo's long hair, a gesture of immense tenderness, and says, "Tomorrow, Phaedo, you will perhaps cut this beautiful hair in mourning." "I suppose so, Socrates," Phaedo replies. "You should not." Socrates smiles. "If our argument dies today and we cannot revive it, then we should cut our hair, but not for me." He rallies them. He warns them against misology, the hatred of reason. Just because some arguments fail, he says, doesn't mean truth doesn't exist. And then he launches into his final defense, not of his life, but of the human soul. He argues that the soul is simple, divine, and akin to the forms, the eternal, invisible truths of beauty, justice, and goodness. Since the soul can grasp these eternal things, it must be like them, eternal and indestructible. He argues that the soul is the ruler of the body, not its slave. When the body dies, the ruler is merely set free. He paints a picture of the philosopher's life as a practicing for death. The philosopher spends his life trying to detach his mind from the distractions of the body, from lust, hunger, and the deceit of the senses. He tries to see with the eye of the mind. If we have been trying all our lives to separate the soul from the body to see the truth, Socrates asks, why should we be afraid when the separation finally happens completely? To fear death is to be a bad philosopher. It is to admit that you love the body more than the truth. The arguments weave back and forth. He answers the objection of the liar. He answers the objection of the weaver and the cloak. He builds a fortress of logic to shelter his friends from their grief. He is not proving immortality with scientific certainty. He admits that is impossible for mortals. But he is offering a noble risk. He is saying, it is worth believing this. The venture is a glorious one. As the afternoon wears on, the shadows in the cell lengthen. The conversation shifts from logic to myth. Socrates tells a story about the true earth, a place of pure light and color, above the heavy, misty hollows where we live. He describes the rivers of the underworld, the judgment of souls, and the purification of the just. It is a poetic vision, a bedtime story for men who are afraid of the dark. A man of sense ought not to say that these things are exactly as I have described them, Socrates concludes, but that this, or something like it, is true concerning our souls and their habitations. This seems to me a risk worth taking. He pauses. The sun is getting low. The jailer enters, a man who has grown fond of Socrates during his imprisonment. He is weeping. Socrates, the man says, choking back tears, I know you are the noblest and gentlest and best of all who ever came to this place. He tells Socrates that the time has come to drink the poison. He apologizes, blaming the laws and the accusers, not himself, and then rushes out, unable to bear the sight. Socrates looks at his friends. How charming the man is, he says warmly. Since I have been here, he has always been good to me. And now see how generously he weeps for me. He turns to Crito. But come, Crito, let us obey him. Let the poison be brought, if it is prepared. Crito hesitates. He points to the window. The sun is still on the hilltops, Socrates. It is not yet set. Others wait until late, eating and drinking and enjoying themselves before they drink the poison. Do not hurry. There is still time. It is a desperate human plea for a few more minutes of life. But Socrates shakes his head. Those men you speak of do right to wait, for they think they gain something by it. But I shall be right not to wait, for I do not think I should gain anything by drinking a little later, except to become ridiculous in my own eyes for clinging to life and saving the dregs of it. He is firm. He will not scavenge for scraps of time. He orders the poison. The servant goes out to grind the hemlock. The cell falls silent. The great argument is over. The logic has been built. The myth has been told. The comfort has been given. Now, there is nothing left but the act itself. The philosopher has finished his work. Now the man must die. The servant has gone to prepare the poison. The cell is quiet, filled with the heavy golden light of the late afternoon. The dust motes dance in the shafts of sun that pierce the high window, undisturbed by the sorrow of the men sitting on the benches. Crito is struggling to compose himself. Phaedo is hiding his face in his cloak. But Socrates, sensing the rising tide of grief in the room, decides to offer them one last image, a metaphor to hold on to when the darkness comes. He remembers a conversation from earlier in the day, a moment when Simmias had laughed at his own skepticism, and he reaches back to that lighter tone. He wants to leave them not with a tragedy, but with a song. You seem to think, Socrates says, smiling at their tear-stained faces, that I am inferior in prophetic power to the swans. The mention of swans makes them look up. It is an unexpected image. In Greek mythology, the swan is the bird of Apollo, the god of music, prophecy, and light. The very god Socrates has served all his life. For they, Socrates continues, his voice taking on a storytelling cadence. When they perceive that they must die, having sung all their life long, do then sing more lustily than ever, rejoicing in the thought that they are about to go away to the God whose ministers they are. He gently corrects a common human misconception. Men, he says, because of their own fear of death, project that fear onto nature. They say the swan sings a lament, a sad song of farewell to the light. But no bird sings when it is cold, or hungry, or in pain, Socrates argues. Not even the nightingale, nor the swallow, nor the hoopoe, but the swans, being sacred to Apollo, have the gift of prophecy and anticipate the good things in another world. Wherefore they sing and rejoice in that day more than ever they did before. He looks at his friends, his eyes wide and clear. And I too, believing myself to be the consecrated servant of the same God, and the fellow servant of the swans, and thinking that I have received from my master gifts of prophecy which are not inferior to theirs, would not go out of life less merrily than the swans. It is a breathtaking comparison. He is reframing his execution as a moment of ecstatic return. He is not a victim being dragged to the slaughter. He is a bird preparing to migrate. The song he has been singing in the prison, the arguments about the soul, the myths of the afterlife, the gentle teasing of Crito, is not a swan song in the tragic sense of a final desperate cry. It is a song of triumph. It is the joyful noise of a creature who knows it is going home. This image of the swan changes the energy in the room. It lifts the weight of the tragedy. If Socrates is happy, how can they be sad? If he sees death as a flight to the god, who are they to anchor him to the earth with their tears? He is inviting them to share in his prophetic vision, to see death not as a wall, but as a window. But the moment of poetry must eventually yield to the moment of chemistry. The heavy wooden door creaks open. The servant returns. He carries a kylix, a shallow clay cup, filled with a dark, murky liquid. It is the hemlock, Conium maculatum, a common weed in the ditches of Attica, yet the most potent political weapon in Athens. The preparation is simple but deadly. The seeds and leaves are ground and mixed with wine or water. It acts as a progressive paralytic. It starts at the extremities, numbing the feet and hands, and works its way inward, slowly shutting down the nervous system, until it reaches the heart or the lungs. It is a cold death, quiet and gradual, unlike the violent convulsions of other poisons. Socrates looks at the man. He does not tremble. He does not hesitate. He asks, with the practical curiosity of a man asking about a recipe, "Well, my good friend, you are experienced in these things. What must I do?" The servant, likely relieved by Socrates' calm, gives the instructions. Nothing but drink it, and walk about until your legs are heavy, and then lie down, and it will act of itself. Socrates takes the cup. His hand is steady. There is no shaking, no spilling of the dark liquid. He looks at the bull-necked servant and asks, in a final flash of his irrepressible humor. What do you say about making a libation out of this cup to some god? May I or not? A libation was a ritual offering, pouring a small amount of wine onto the ground for the gods. The servant, perhaps missing the irony, or perhaps just following protocol, replies dryly, "We only prepare, Socrates, just so much as we deem enough." "I understand." Socrates nods. "But I may and must ask the gods to prosper my journey from this to that other world. Even so, I make my prayer, and may it be so." And then, without a grimace of disgust, without a pause for breath, he raises the cup to his lips and drains it. He drinks it readily and cheerfully. Plato writes, "It is done." The irrevocable act. The poison is inside him. The clock of his body has started its final countdown. Until this moment, his friends have managed to hold back their tears. They have been sustained by the argument, by the swan myth, by his strength. But seeing him drink the poison breaks the dam. Apollodorus, who has been weeping quietly all along, lets out a loud, jagged roar of grief. Crito gets up and rushes out of the room, unable to control himself. Phaedo covers his face. The room dissolves into a chaotic, weeping mess. They are not crying for him. As Phaedo admits later, they are crying for themselves, for the craving of such a friend. Socrates alone remains calm. He looks around at the weeping men with a mixture of surprise and sternness. "What is this strange outcry?" he demands. "I sent away the women mainly in order that they might not offend in this way, for I have heard that a man should die in peace. Be quiet, then, and have patience." His words act like a slap. The men feel ashamed. They choke back their tears. They wipe their faces. They fall silent, watching the old man. Socrates obeys the instructions. He stands up and begins to walk around the small cell. He paces back and forth, his bare feet moving rhythmically on the stone floor. He is walking to circulate the poison, to help it kill him. It is a surreal sight. A healthy, strong man walking briskly to his own death, chatting with his friends as he does so. He walks until his legs begin to feel heavy, as if he has hiked a long distance. "The cold is coming," he says. He lies down on his back on the simple wooden bed. The servant kneels beside him. The room is silent now, save for the shallow breathing of the watchers. The sun has set. The cell is filling with the grey light of evening. The world is narrowing down to the figure on the bed. The paralysis is creeping up. The servant touches his foot. He presses hard. "Do you feel that?" the servant asks. "No," Socrates replies. The servant presses his shin. No feeling. The coldness is moving up the legs, turning the flesh to marble. The sensation, or lack of it, is rising like a tide. Socrates touches himself, feeling the numbness. He remarks that when the poison reaches the heart, that will be the end. He lies there, covering his face with his cloak, perhaps to spare his friends the sight of his dying eyes, or perhaps to concentrate on the final transition. The room waits. The history of philosophy holds its breath. And then, just when they think he is gone, he uncovers his face. His eyes are open. He has one last thing to say. One last debt to pay. The room is still. The only sound is the ragged breathing of Phaedo and the other friends, who are trying desperately to obey their master's command to be silent. Socrates lies on the narrow wooden bed, his body covered by the rough woolen cloak. The paralysis, cold and heavy, has claimed his feet, his shins, his thighs. It is moving inexorably upward, a rising tide of silence shutting down the machinery of the most active man in Athens. The servant has stepped back into the shadows. Crito sits by the bedside, his hand resting on Socrates' shoulder, waiting for the end. The sun has completely vanished now, and the cell is steeped in the blue-gray gloom of twilight. It is that liminal hour between day and night, between the visible world and the unknown. Suddenly, the cloak moves. Socrates pulls the fabric down from his face. His skin is pale, but his eyes are still clear, still lucid, still fixed on the truth. He looks at Crito. He has one final thought, one last piece of business to conduct before the shop closes forever. His lips move. The voice is faint, no longer the resonant baritone that filled the agora, but a whisper that forces Crito to lean in close. "Crito," he says, "we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it, and do not neglect it." These are the last words of Socrates. 12 simple words in Greek. To Asclepius, a rooster we owe. And for 24 centuries, the world has argued over what they meant. Asclepius was the god of medicine, the healer. It was customary for a patient recovering from a serious illness to offer a rooster as a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Was Socrates saying that death is the cure? Was he suggesting that life, with its confusion and its body-trapped soul, is a kind of long sickness, and that death is the final healing? It is the interpretation that Nietzsche and the Romantics loved, the idea that the philosopher hates life. But perhaps there is a simpler, warmer truth. Perhaps he was thinking of his own soul, now purified by philosophy, finally healthy and whole, ready to stand up and walk. Or perhaps, with his characteristic attention to detail, he simply remembered a literal debt he had forgotten to pay, a small promise to a god that he refused to leave unfulfilled. Even in the grip of the poison, he remains a man of integrity. He does not want to leave the world with a balance due. "It shall be done," Crito assures him, his voice cracking. He waits a moment, holding his breath. Is there anything else? There is no answer. The silence that follows is not the pause of a conversation. It is the silence of an empty room. The hemlock has reached the heart. There is a slight movement, a final shudder, perhaps a spasm of the nerves, as the spirit uncouples from the flesh, and then stillness. His eyes remain fixed, staring at a ceiling he no longer sees. His mouth is slightly open, as if he were about to ask one last question. Crito, the loyal friend who had tried to buy his life, now performs the final service for his death. He reaches out with trembling hands and gently closes Socrates' mouth. Then he presses his thumbs against the eyelids, sliding them down over those bulging, intense eyes that had scrutinized the soul of a city. The face of Socrates, usually so animated and mobile, settles into the heavy, waxen mask of peace. Phaedo, the young narrator of this scene, looks at the body and feels a wave of orphanhood wash over him. "This was the end of our friend," he later writes. "A man who was, we may say, the best of all the men of his time whom we have known, and moreover the wisest and most just." The servant checks the body. He pinches the arm. There is no response. The heat has left the core. The gadfly is dead. The horse of Athens is finally free of its sting. The nuisance has been removed. The accusers, Meletus, Anytus, Lycon, have won. They have successfully used the machinery of the state to crush the individual. They can go home now and sleep without fear of being asked what virtue means. But as the friends sit in the darkening cell, weeping now without restraint, they do not yet realize the scope of their teacher's victory. They see a corpse. They do not yet see the resurrection. They do not know that by drinking the cup, Socrates has transformed himself from a local eccentric into a universal archetype. He has turned a legal execution into a moral triumph. The poison did not kill him, it distilled him. It stripped away the mortal man, the snub nose, the paunch, the poverty, and left behind the pure, indestructible essence of the question. The night deepens over Athens. The prison guards lock the gates. The friends eventually leave, walking out into a city that feels smaller, emptier, and colder. They carry the news with them like a heavy stone. He is gone. But in the silence of the cell, something has shifted. The argument with the laws is over, but the argument with the world has just begun. The body on the bed is finished, but the voice is about to become louder than it ever was in life. The cell is empty now, save for the body covered in the rough cloak. The friends have dispersed into the night, carrying their grief like a physical weight through the winding streets of Athens. The city sleeps, unaware that its most famous son has just become its eternal ghost. To the average Athenian waking up the next morning, the world looks exactly the same. The sun rises over the Hymettus mountains, the market stalls open, the fishmongers shout their prices, and the politicians argue in the assembly. The Socrates problem has been solved. The irritant is gone. Life, presumably, will return to normal. But history has a way of punishing those who try to kill an idea. The death of Socrates did not bring the silence Anytus and Meletus had hoped for. Instead, it triggered an explosion of words that is still echoing today. The backlash was almost immediate. The city began to feel the phantom limb of its missing conscience. Within a few years, the mood in Athens shifted from defensiveness to deep regret. A story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally true, tells us that when the tragedy of Palamedes, another innocent man wrongly executed, was performed in the theater, the audience burst into tears at the line, you have killed the all-wise, the innocent nightingale of the Muses." They were not weeping for Palamedes, they were weeping for the barefoot man they had buried. Legend says that the Athenians eventually turned on the accusers. Meletus was reportedly banished or even stoned to death by a mob. Anytus was driven out of the city. A bronze statue of Socrates, sculpted by the famous Lysippos, was erected in the Pompeion, a place of honor. The city that killed him ended up worshipping him. But statues crumble, bronze melts. The true monument to Socrates was not built of metal, but of ink. It was Plato, the broad-shouldered wrestler turned philosopher, who ensured that Socrates would never truly die. He was 28 years old when his teacher drank the hemlock. He was sick with grief, perhaps even physically ill, as he missed the final death scene. But he took that grief and forged it into the most powerful literary weapon the world had ever seen, the dialogue. He recreated Socrates on the page. He made him speak again. He captured the humor, the irony, the infuriating logic, and the sudden, stunning moments of beauty. In dialogue after dialogue, the Apology, the Crito, the Phaedo, the Republic, Plato forced Athens, and eventually the whole world, to sit in the jury box and retry the case. But this time, Socrates was the judge, and the world was on trial. Plato's genius was to make Socrates immortal by making him literature. We do not know the historical Socrates perfectly. He wrote nothing, after all. We know the Socrates of Plato, the Socrates of Xenophon, the Socrates of Aristophanes. He is a mosaic of memories, but the figure that emerges, the man who questions, the man who admits ignorance, the man who prefers death to wickedness, became the patron saint of the intellectual life. Because of that trial, philosophy ceased to be just a word for curious men studying stars or rocks. It became a moral vocation. It became a way of life that requires courage. Socrates showed that the search for truth is not a safe academic hobby. It is a contact sport. It is dangerous. It puts you at odds with the mob, with the state, and often with your own comfort. He established the right of the individual conscience to stand against the collective power of the state. When he said, "I will obey God rather than you," he planted the seed of civil disobedience that would grow into Thoreau, Gandhi, and King. As you look back on this story, drifting away from the dust of the agora and the stone of the prison, remember that the trial was not a failure. It was the necessary tragedy that birthed the Western mind. If Socrates had been acquitted, if he had paid a fine and gone back to his wife, Xanthippe, he would be a footnote. By dying, he became a question mark burned into the human psyche. The city of Athens eventually fell. Its temples were looted, its walls crumbled, its statues were carried off to Rome and Constantinople and London. The empire of the intellect that Socrates founded, however, has no borders and no ruins. It is built every time someone asks why. It is built every time a student challenges a teacher, every time a citizen challenges a leader, every time a mind refuses to accept an easy lie. So, the next time you hear a question that makes you uncomfortable, a question that shakes your certainty and makes you want to swat the asker away, stop. Listen. It might be the gadfly buzzing in the dark, trying to wake you up. The bronze discs have long since rusted into the earth. The water clock is dry. The voices of the jury, the shouts of the accusers, and the quiet, rumbly voice of the philosopher have all faded into the great silence of the centuries. The cell door is open now, swinging gently on phantom hinges. The sun has set on ancient Athens, leaving the white marble to glow softly under the light of the stars. The same stars that Socrates once claimed he did not study, though he surely loved them. Let the scene dissolve now. Let the agora soften into a blur of warm light and shadow. You are no longer standing in the dust of history. You are safe, warm, and resting in the quiet of your own time. The tension of the trial is gone. The anger and the grief have washed away, leaving only a deep, abiding peace. Think of Socrates not as a tragic figure, but as a friend who has simply gone ahead to prepare the conversation. He is there, in the quiet spaces of your mind, reminding you that it is okay not to know. It is okay to wonder. It is okay to be unfinished. The unexamined life is hard, but the examined life is an adventure that never ends, even when the eyes close. Let your breathing slow down, deep, steady, and calm. The questions of the day are done. The answers can wait until tomorrow. For now, there is only the comfort of the night, the heavy, sweet feeling of rest, and the knowledge that wisdom is not a race, but a gentle, drifting journey. Sleep now. The gadfly has stopped buzzing. The swan has taken flight. The argument is over. Sweet dreams.